Good evening. I'd like to call this meeting of the Columbus Board of Education to order and ask the treasurer to call the roll. Mr. Treasurer?
President Baker. Mr. Brown. Here. Vice President Cole. Present. Ms. Gibbs.
Here.
Ms. Hudson. Mr. Ferretti. Here. Ms. Reyes. Here. You have a quorum, Mr. President.
Mr. Treasurer, thank you very much. And I would ask you all to be upstanding for the Pledge of Allegiance, and I'll lead us this evening.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. Well, good evening, and welcome to this special work session of the Columbus Board of Education. As we discuss our administration's proposed efforts to address future gaps in the final out years of our district's 5-year financial forecast. Before we begin, I want to share an important figure, $100 million. That's the amount of money that the state legislature continues to shortchange the students of the district by capping our state aid at an amount far, far less than what the state funding formula promises. As our treasurer will share again tonight, the state funding cap now robs our district and this community of $100 million annually. That's the same as all of our kindergartners, first graders, second graders, third graders, and nearly all of our fourth graders essentially receiving no state funding. And don't be fooled by those bureaucrats who say the state gave us more money than the year before. They've never given our students all that was promised in the first place, and this lack of support is catching up. Make no mistake, this district and this board have been good financial stewards of the district's resources, with tens of millions of dollars saved in our operations over the past decade and tens of millions more found in the sale of surplus buildings. In fact, it's this financial stewardship combined with voter support in the last levy that's keeping this district in the black for the next 3 years despite the state's lack of support. But we can only cover for so long. And this continuing lack of state support drives the projected deficits in the out years of our current 5-year financial forecast. We know the belt tightening of our teachers, staffs, administrators can only trim so much. We know that reductions in service levels to our students and their families can only reach so deep before we jeopardize our primary mission of academic achievement. And we know that any reductions in staffing, even through attrition, should be a last resort. While the state seems to ignore this problem year after year, the Board of Education simply cannot. So we must have serious discussions, and we need to have them now or risk even deeper reductions in the future. And we need to hear all ideas, leaving nothing off the table, turning over every rock that isn't required by state law. We should honor the everyday savings taking place in our classrooms and offices by teachers, secretaries, custodians, principals, and others who are already doing more with less. We must keep every number in perspective, and we will open the conversation to a larger audience. Every person in our community is invited to talk to us online, on the app, on the phone, through the mail, and in person where possible. We've given everyone here tonight information on how to share your input and feedback on these budget conversations, and I encourage you to join in. You all should have received one of these when you came in. So tonight we have a full agenda. We'll hear first from our treasurer, Stan Bohoric, who will help us all get a shared understanding of the financial forecast and how the conversation today has a real impact on our projections 4 and 5 years from now. Next, we'll hear from Interim Superintendent Dr. John Stanford and his leadership team, who will help board members delve deeper into the proposed reductions and the thinking behind them. Then we'll talk about next steps. Before we dive in, though, let me offer my appreciation to our interim superintendent, treasurer, and the staff here, and to my colleagues. You put a lot of time and preparation into this meeting this evening. Budget reductions, even just the talk of potential reductions, it's never an easy topic. Every investment we make as a district is valuable. And behind the dollar signs are the faces of our more than 51,000 students and almost 9,000 employees. These conversations aren't meant to discredit the value of any person or program, but instead to recognize that we must set priorities. It would be very easy to fall into self-preservation mode, playing favorites to those whose voices are louder, not necessarily those who have the most impact on our students or greatest return on our public investment. I appreciate that our process has been data-driven and that we've all come here tonight with an open mind and a willingness to have constructive conversations. And I hope that continues throughout this entire process, because this is a conversation we must have if we are to keep our commitment to good financial stewardship of this community's precious resources. And with that, let us begin with Treasurer Bohoric. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you, President Baker. Vice President Cole, members of the board. My task here this evening is to, set the stage for these discussions. Some of this should be very familiar with you because my comments will center around the 5-year forecast, which is our document that looks out into the future to see where our trends are taking us and to alert us to financial situations that we have to address, and alert us in time that we can address them efficiently as possible. So we'll begin with where we were in the October forecast, and this is the October of 2017. And this is simply summarizing the cash balance from that forecast. And as you can see, for the 5 years in the forecast ending with fiscal year 22, or the 2021-22 school year, that forecast projected a cash deficit of approximately $224 million. At the time I presented the October forecast, I had discussed with the board the changes to 3 major assumptions that we made, not only when we were in the process of levy planning back in June of 2016, but also as I then updated you in December after the levy passage. And I'll reiterate those to you so you know what changed from 2016 to October of 2017 and how that impacted the picture as reflected here in the declining cash balance. First, one of our assumptions was that a 5.58 operating levy would be approved at the November 2016 ballot. And in fact, that assumption proved to be true. Our voters supported us and passed that overwhelmingly. Secondly, we assumed that the increases in the cap would be, and that cap, not the calculation, but the cap that we're faced with, that increases to that cap would continue at a rate that was comparable to, actually identical to, the last biennium, and that was at plus 7.5% per year. So we used that plus 7.5% growth in the cap for each of the 5 years of the forecast back in 16 and beginning in May of 17 as well. That assumption unfortunately proved not to come true, as we learned during the discussions this past spring of the state budget. I think in the beginning, one of the bills that had, I believe, come out of the House was at 0% cap growth. And the Senate then, I think, put forth, the governor's proposal, I think, put forth 5. And then what ultimately came out of the Senate was approved by both houses was a plus 4%. So we had an assumption of plus 7.5%, and the cap actually is now growing at a plus 4%. Last was that in the forecast prior to 17, we had not included or assumed anything about wage increases beyond the then in force collective bargaining agreements, and subsequent to that, by the time we got to October 17, we had agreed to some increases in the various collective bargaining agreements. So I then went on and detailed the impact that the various changes had on the cash balance, and overwhelmingly, the change in the cap growth was the key contributor to the decline in cash balance. At that point in time, as we were looking at just out to fiscal 21, because I was comparing back to the May forecast of 16, which had 21 as the last year, there was a net decline of $91 million. Now, $127 million of that decline was due to that change in cap growth rate. We had some other revenue lines that we had increased a bit, but net, we had dropped $91 million. That's how and if you recall, we were forecasting fiscal 21 and projecting it out to be zero during the levying campaign. That was our target. We were going to land at zero. Whether or not that was a fair assumption to have or not, but that kept the levy millage in where it was, and we thought that would be our target. With these changes, that year, 21, went negative. When we got to October 17, we had to add another fiscal year. And as you can imagine, things only get worse because your revenues are below your expenditures. And so in that's how we got down to 224 for fiscal 22. So again, the overwhelming impact came from that change in state funding. So faced with this deficit, the question then becomes, what do you do to address this? Like any other school district, we can increase revenue, we can decrease expenditures, or we can do a combination of the two. At this point in time, when we began to look at this deficit and how we would address it, the revenue side of the equation was off the table. Number one, we know what the state budget is for the next 2 years, and we don't know what it will be like after that. And our ability to impact that is not significant, in my opinion. The other major source of revenue for us is local property taxes. And it was clear, at least to us, that there was a desire that we would not be back on the ballot until 2020. So factoring that into our forecast or into our analysis is really off the table as well. We'll keep that in the back of our minds, but that's not out until 2020, and that's really the first impact you feel for that is basically in the 2022 school year. It's way out in the distance. So with revenue off the table, we're left with expenditures. And how do we begin to look at our budget and identify potential areas for possible reduction? And I shared with the administration, the leadership team, just a way of thinking about how we might begin to, I guess, categorize or evaluate various budget line items. And I presented to them this matrix. You can call it a decision matrix, you can call it an evaluation matrix. But what I thought this would do for us would allow us to organize our thoughts around the various budget lines. And this matrix, the first axis in the matrix, across the top is required and not required. We can look at our budget line items in the sense of, are we required to do this item or are we not required to do this item? And that requirement could be state law requires it, federal law requires it, board policy requires it. The superintendent just wants to do it, as an example, but how you define required is really what lens are you looking at it through. But keeping that in mind as one criteria. Then we looked on the other axis as what's the return on that investment? What do we get? What's the impact on our programs and on our operations? For that investment of dollars and staff and time and effort, is the return on that investment high or is it relatively low? And if we then categorize our budget line items this way and consider them in this fashion, we end up with 4 possible outcomes. We're required to do it, and the return is very high, so we want to keep doing that. We're required to do it, so we would be inclined to keep it, but if the return on investment is very low, we might want to reconsider it. Is there another way to do it? We have to do it, but is there another way to do it to have a better return on that investment? On the not required side of things, if we're not required to do it, but the return on investment is high, initially we might be inclined to simply reduce the item because we're not required to do it. But if the return is very high, again, gives us pause for thought, and maybe we should reconsider how we do that. Even though it's not required, we might want to try and keep that item around because the return on investment is high. And last, and this is probably the quadrant of this matrix you don't want to live in, and that is we're not required to do it, and the return on investment is low. And those are items that I think one board member, maybe Board Member Peretti, has referred to some things as low-hanging fruit. Those items that we're not required to do, that we don't have a real good return on the investment, either operationally or instructionally, then those are the ones that would be most likely to be on the reduction list. This isn't a hard and fast rule. It was just a way for us to begin to organize our thoughts and lead us through the discussion of what would be recommended versus not recommended, if you will. So I go back to the October forecast and our cash balance, and as I did last October, and as we do every time we talk about the forecast, I want to remind everyone that 0 is not our ending cash balance target, or should not be, realistically. Best practices say that we should target 30 days operating cash, which in our case would be about $80 million. So here, if our target is 80 million positive and we're projecting 224 million deficit, the differential there is just over 300 million, about $304 million. So to move ourselves from this deficit position to the positive cash position that we would desire to be would require us to identify an accumulated effect of about 304 million. When we got into this, we decided to look for items that, when put into effect, would remain in effect for the balance of the forecast. So those items that we would look at reducing in the fiscal year 18-19, the next school year coming up, they would come out of all 4 years. In simple math, if you will, I think Dr. Stanford mentioned at the FAC meeting that $1 million in 18-19 gets you $4 million accumulated by the end of the year. So 50 million in reductions gets you 200 million by the end of this forecast period. And that speaks to timing in any forecast and in addressing deficits. Timing is of the essence. What we do now minimizes the impact. It minimizes what we have to do if we delay those. So addressing a $200 million deficit with a year to go is much, much more difficult than speaking to it with 4 years to go. So that's just how the math works. It's a lot easier to begin to address it now, and that's what we're doing. We're beginning to address it now. So that's the targets we were looking at. Since we began our discussions, we learned that there is a continuing resolution to keep the federal government open and running. And in that continuing resolution, they once again delayed the Cadillac tax, which is part of the Affordable Care Act. That was the equivalent on an accumulated basis of about $12 million. So we backed that out. As you can see, that then takes our projected deficit to about 212 million from the 224. We then looked at something that we would not necessarily include in our forecast. We wouldn't have this reflected in the forecast. But you know, we speak all the time about we do conservative forecasting, and we expect a positive cash flow result at the end of each fiscal year going forward. When we look at these reductions and look at the process for addressing the deficit, administratively in our thought process, we wanted to say, well, how much might we be able to count on from this positive cash flow? And so in this particular case, we factored in about $15 million a year, and for 4 years. I think that's $60 million if my math is correct. So that backs us up to now $152 million deficit to address. And as we got into our discussions and began to look at various reduction possibilities, we identified $21 million annually, which is about $84 million compounded effect, which then, if we were to factor all of this into the forecast, the Cadillac tax delay, positive cash flow variances, and then these reductions, you'd see that 2021 is now positive. It doesn't it's closer to, but does not meet our 30-day cash balance requirement of about $80 million. And the 2022 deficit, 21-22 deficit, is now $68 million, with still being short of that $80 million target. That leaves us with about $148 million yet to address to get to that ending cash balance. As with the forecast, and it certainly holds true in my analysis and presentation here, this is highly dependent on the assumptions that we employ in this analysis. We heard first that the board priorities were no new levy till 2020, that we would keep the levy promises to add the full-time equivalent positions, and that we would attempt to minimize the impact to academic program. What I put forth here also assumes no change in the October 2017 5-year forecast revenue assumptions. So the plus 4% in state cap increases is still an assumption, and we have not factored in any new monies from a new levy. In the forecast, even though you might say we're planning on it, I can't put it in the forecast. They don't allow that. It's only allowed once it passes, which is why I gave you a December 2016 update to the forecast. Once it passed, I put it in the forecast, gave you that update, and it demonstrated that the impact on the forecast was exactly what we had predicted, that being that 2021 would go essentially zero. We assume that the Cadillac tax delay remains in effect. Sometimes I believe that what the federal government giveth, they can taketh away as well. So, but we assume that it does stay into effect and it's been delayed 2 years. I think another very important assumption, because I would not factor this into my forecast, but I will factor it into this discussion and analysis, is that we do yield those conservative forecasting gains of about $15 million a year. Two, that these reductions that are proposed and whatever is eventually adopted will remain in force through fiscal 2022. If you reduce them 1 year but add them back 2 years later, that goes against what this analysis would show. And that we're all comfortable with and agree that a 30-day cash balance target is something we should strive for. Any changes in any of these assumptions moves the cash balance line. If you don't go for a levy in 2020, if you decide to go for a levy sooner, if the Cadillac tax somehow comes back, if our conservative forecasting doesn't yield positive cash flow, any one of those assumptions changes. You change the assumption about the state cap growth. I don't mean to pick twice. I picked on Board Member Peretti as examples here, but when we went through that state budget discussion, there was some conversation about what should we assume. Quite frankly, I put forth on the table perhaps we should assume something less. Mr. Peretti, which is fine, an advocate that we can just assume that they will do what they've been doing in the past biennium. That's a very, very valid assumption, and we all agreed, granted through FAC, and we adopted the forecast, that assuming plus 4% was okay. If you change your mind and think something less than plus 4 is appropriate, it certainly becomes a more conservative estimate. but then it exacerbates the deficit that we're facing. So with that, I think that sets the stage pretty much for where we are. I hope that you understand that it is fraught with assumptions. And if you agree with these, then we're all working from the same set of assumptions and the premise that got us here and how we're going to kind of move forward in assessing what we need to do for the future. But I think that should bring us up to date at this point. And with that, unless there are any other questions or if I've left anything out, I'm looking around the room to see if I forgot anything. I will turn it over, I believe, to Dr. Stanford to do the next part.
If there are no questions from board members, brief questions at this time from board members, Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm not sure if this question will be answered. I'm not sure if this question will be answered in your presentation, Dr. Stanford, but is a buyout option for retired eligible employees a viable option here to help reduce the threat of reductions?
Those often work depending upon how they're structured. There's straight incentives. There are also what they call ERIPs, early retirement incentive programs, which are done through the retirement systems. They're all structured very, very differently. Typically, they're most beneficial if you have older staff, older, I'm sure chronologically, but older in terms of years of service. So if you have a higher proportion of your staff eligible for or very close to being eligible for retirement, those programs tend to work. As you may recall, both retirement systems had a significant change in the criteria for eligibility to retire, and there was a fairly large exodus several years ago of staff, both certificated and classified from the district. And while I have not right now currently looked at a scattergram, if you will, of where our staff is along the continuum of years of service, it would be a pretty easy, safe assumption to say that the staff is much younger than it was 2 years ago in terms of years of service, which reduces the effectiveness of those incentives. We have not assessed any at this point. We have a couple of models to work through. So to tell you whether or not it's viable, my personal, what I know right now, very quick, would be they probably won't look to be viable, but we will certainly run those numbers. And it's simply because of the experience level of the staff and what happened a couple of years ago with the what I call an exodus of folks getting into retirement.
Please do, because I'd like to be able to see that and consider that and take that up.
Sure,
Thank
we will.
you.
Thank you. Board Member Brown?
Yes, thank you. Mr. Behoric, we talked very briefly about one of the assumptions, and I know there's a whole host of assumptions, and you've said that, and I know you mean it. I know that can change the picture considerably based on, whether we guess right or not. And we want to do that based on all the best available information and make guesses that make sense. The one that concerns me most is the cap, the increase on the cap that the legislature revisits every 2 years. And last time around, we made a reasonable and fair assumption that the legislature would do what it's done for a number of years, for a number of budget cycles at 7.5%. And we ended up with a increase on the cap of 4%, which is a significant part of what put us here now. And my question, and I know we're not going to solve this tonight, but I think it is something that the board needs to talk about further, along with the best advice we can get on this is, does it make sense for us to continue now with a 4% assumption? It's anybody's guess who may be governing next year, or next time the legislature gets to this, and whether they're going to, support increase, decrease. And we don't know all of the factors with the economy that the legislature may be looking at that time. So my question is really one of, do we want to keep our assumption there, or should we consider a lower increase? I know that by doing that, what we're doing is increasing the deficit, and that would mean that we have to look harder and cut deeper than what's currently on the table. But I think it's simply one of the assumptions that makes a big difference, probably a bigger difference in our school district than in any other in the state. From a dollar standpoint, I'm sure that's true. So just like to hear your thoughts, and how do we get the best information to be able to make this assumption?
Sure. Board Member Brown. As we put together the forecast, in the back of my mind always is another revenue source, and that's a local levy. And as the pieces of this puzzle come together and you look at where your expenditures are going, what you assume about state revenue impacts what you might have to do from a local revenue standpoint. And so to the extent that you stay on the revenue side of the ledger and you assume something less in state revenue, that simply drives millage for the operating levy up. I mean, that's just how the math works. You've got pluses on the revenue side and minuses on the expenditure side, and increases or decreases to one push the other in a different direction. So I think it's obviously a great topic when we get into the forecast. As you said, we're not going to solve the problem tonight, and I don't know that. I mean, if you want to go to that point and recast the forecast, as you just said, recast the forecast. That was interesting. Recast the forecast with a different assumption. It's easy enough for me to say this, as you just said. It just simply exacerbates the problem. I think what we'll have to have discussions about, because we've just lived through, or currently living through a situation of one of the types of errors that can occur in forecasting. One is that you, on the revenue side, forecast too high and it comes in lower, and the other is you forecast too low and it comes in higher. If you forecast too low and it comes in higher, some might say, well, gee, had you had a better number, had you known. I always like that when people say, well, had you known that, and I'm going, well, that's a forecast. I really don't know a whole lot of certainty in a forecast, but had you known that and had your revenue forecast been higher, then you would be able to do more, implement more programs, something along those lines. And so you have not done some. That's the error. That's that kind of the type 1, type 2 error situation. Forecasting revenue too low, you preclude yourself from doing something. On the other hand, if you forecast too high and revenue comes in too low, then you've put in place things that you have to back out. And so then you're in a reduction mode. So I don't have a perfect answer for that, but that's why you have the discussions, and we all have a meeting of the minds as to what are reasonable assumptions to make, knowing full well that, number one, actual will be different than what we projected, and which side of the ledger do you want to fall on? We have typically fallen on the conservative side, and had, as I said here earlier, positive cash flow results. You are suggesting by a more conservative revenue estimate that we increase the probability that we hit those numbers, and if anything, that the error is more likely the revenue comes in higher than lower. And if that's a more preferred state, then yes, lowering that estimate would be in line. So food for thought, and I could talk for hours about it if you like, but that's probably not what we want to do here. But I think we're on the same page on that.
Any other questions from board members? Thank you. Mr. Superintendent?
Thank you, Mr. President. The discussion about the impact of the state's budget decision on our 5-year forecast began in August of 2017. The discussion on the 5-year forecast concluded with the board's adoption of a new one in October of 2017. The board gave the administration explicit guidance to begin the process of reviewing budget items. Treasurer Behorg mentioned that guidance in his presentation a few minutes ago. With that guidance from the board and their directive to put all budget items on the table for consideration, the administration began a discussion to develop a decision-making framework that the treasurer has already shared and a timeline for a review of the district's entire budget. The goal of that review was to identify budget items that could be candidates for elimination or reduction in the upcoming fiscal year 2018-2019 budget. The criteria that we use has already been discussed by the treasurer, but I would like to provide a little bit more detail on the return on investment criterion. As a part of that return on investment, we definitely looked at data that is available to us for that particular budget item, and we also used our professional judgment and our implementation of that program or the use of the dollars in that line item as a part of our daily work. But we also wanted to make sure that the line item was aligned to the district's mission and the district goals. And we also wanted to make sure that there was high alignment to our traditional core academic mandates of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The admission first reviewed all budget line items starting in early November and continued to refine its analysis of the budget items in December and in early January. A summary of the administration's analysis was presented to the Finance and Appropriations Committee on January the 18th. The list of reviewed budget items are in the handout tonight. Please note that there were some budget items that we did not review because we are required to pay the expenditure. For instance, the order of state fees for our annual audit, the charter school deduct, tuition fees paid to other school districts for services rendered to those students from Columbus City Schools, and environmental and safety inspection fees and assessments. For all of these items and more, we do not have a choice but to pay those items. The handout before you tonight is organized with the following columns. First, offices. There are 11 offices listed in the handout: academic services, accountability, board services, budget, business and operations, communications, district-wide, internal audit, legal services, superintendent, and treasurer. Next column is entitled groups. There are 9 groups or categories. Those 9 groups are partnerships, operations, administration buildings, school choice / transportation, programs, and personnel. The criteria that we've already discussed is the 3rd column. The 4th column is titled budget item. The 5th column is a brief discussion of the listed budget item. The 6th column is is a column that shows whether the administration is recommending that item for reduction or elimination, or that we considered that item but are not recommending it for elimination at this time or reduction. And then finally, the last column presents the potential savings for that particular budget item. For the audience who would like to review this document, it is available on the board's website under the board docs agenda. Now, let's start our review. As we go through this review, I'm going to start with the office. So first up would be academic services. And for each office, there are groups that are identified for each office. And so first up is academic services partnerships. But let me say real quickly that the academic services office is represented this evening by Chief Academic Officer Alicia Gillison and Executive Director David Baker. The academic services partnership group are those budget items considered that we partner with external partners in order to provide those services to the district. And so at this point, I would open the floor to the board to ask our team any questions that you may have upon your review of those items listed under academic service partnerships.
Thank you. Are there questions, Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. I had a question regarding the recommended personnel for full-time employee reductions for career readiness. I'd like to know what the presumable impact to this would be with these reduction in FTEs. We have a 28% student representation between 11th and 12th grade in these programs. We have a success rate of 90%, 9 out of 10 students graduating with credentials in many instances out of these programs. What is the presumed impact? How do we maintain the success given some of these recommended reductions in full-time employees?
Mr. Vice President, I think you skipped ahead a couple
Oh,
of
I'm
pages.
sorry.
That's all right.
Sorry.
That's all
I'm
right.
always moving too fast.
That's all right.
Forgive me.
That's no problem. So we're on page 1, Academic Services Partnerships. Are there any questions, Mr. Brown?
I apologize. The question that I have is really basic. It's not page 1 per se, but two things. One is when you provided these drafts to us in the first time, you mentioned that we would not see, not only would we not see the non-discretionary items, and that we would not see the items that are required by law, federal or state, but you mentioned that we would not see items that the administration believed are necessary for the efficient and effective operation of the district. Can you give me an example and tell me what that's about?
Sure. What we were trying to communicate with that line or that sentence is that there are certain line items that are in our budget that are, critical to the functioning and operation of the programs and of the services that we offer. And so one example, could be, particular travel or particular conferences that are associated with, let's say, our gifted program or our special education services where, we have to go to that particular conference in order to make sure that we are compliant, with the requirements and mandates of state and federal law.
Okay, and most of those then are mandated by law.
Well,
And I guess what,
it's the training that you receive through that conference that's mandated by law, that you stay current on the requirements in the law.
Okay.
And whatever regulations that may have been adopted to implement that particular law.
okay, all right, that's helpful. And the other fundamental question, I guess, is that I understand the distinction on the return on investments, ROI, have been grouped into either high or low. I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about how that was done, who decided that it's high or low. It's obviously something that will have the ultimate responsibility to make those decisions.
Yes.
But administratively, with the recommendations, you've tagged some as high and some as low. Can you tell me how that was derived?
Sure. Using the matrix that the treasurer referred to in a meeting of our staff, we all reviewed that matrix, and Mr. Bohork explained the matrix to us, and we came to a consensus that we thought it would be a good tool to help us sort of make those subjective decisions about the programs that we have, because it would be great if we had data on every program or every budget line item, but we don't have data on every budget line item. And so for those programs or line items that we do have data, that was the first cut, if you will, on our analysis. So we looked at our data that we had available. Then, as I mentioned in my remarks, we asked the leaders of those particular budget items to use their professional judgment in their day-to-day work to provide evidence or information as to the effectiveness or the efficiency of that particular line item in delivering services to our students. And so, they would give us that professional judgment along with any data that was available to help us figure out if the item was high or low. But the first decision-making on whether it was high or low was made by the budget owner or the budget process owner who works with that budget on a daily basis.
And I guess what that, to me, what I hear is that with budget owners making the first assessment of that return on investment, the folks looking at that are the most highly invested
Yes.
and interested in that particular area. And there would be a natural bias or interest in talking about its importance.
Yep.
Similar to the what we hear from the community as we get emails and calls and things. If I'm an art teacher and I'm talking about the art budget, then I'm talking about its importance and ranking it pretty highly in the scheme of things.
Yes.
And the same would be true for anything across the board. So what check do you have to have another set of eyes from a district-wide perspective rather than the narrow perspective that each person has to adjust that as necessary?
Sure.
And has that been done yet, or is that something that's yet to be done in the process?
No, it was done, as I mentioned in my remarks. I mentioned that the senior leadership team engaged in a refinement of the items identified by those budget owners during the month of December, starting in November through the month of December and through early January. And so each of those items had to be defended by that budget owner to our senior leadership team. And so given the expertise around our senior leadership team, being able to defend that, yes, this is a high or low return on investment would be a pretty challenging task because of the type of, again, diverse experience that we have on our leadership team.
That's helpful. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Board Member Gibbs, I believe you were next. Ms. Reyes?
Not on page
All right. Ms. Gibbs?
Thank you. Thank you, President Banker. Thank you, Dr. Stanford. Thank you to the academic services team. I know this is not easy. This really hits to the core of our business. So I just want to ask a question around a few of the recommendations. Namely, one of them is Woodcrest. In this document, it offers a reduction of year-round that supports the cost of intercession for the
We're on page one. We're going page by page.
I thought we said we were on academic services.
Page one of academic services.
You restricting us by page?
Yeah, sorry. Thank you.
I'll see you about page 4.
We'll come back to you. Mr. Peretti?
Thank you, everyone, for coming in tonight. Looking over the partnerships, and it takes a village. We're all in this together. It's not just the school district. I see items like I Know I Can listed on here. I've also seen that I Know I Can has been expanding some of their services to other school districts, and the county essentially is helping pick that up. Have we had any of our partners, after we've been talking about these potential budget deficits, has anyone come to the table to ask to help us more with some of these programs? And when we do ask for these partnerships, how sustainable are they? We pay for I Know I Can every year. I get that. We know we're going to continue it. But if we do these partnerships, can we really guarantee sustainability long-term investment, not just a flash in the pan a year or two. So I guess it's sort of a twofold question. Have we had anyone come to us and ask, can we help out with some of these partnerships, some of the bills that you're paying? We're all in this together. Has anyone come and said that to us yet? And how sustainable are those partnerships when the school district isn't paying that bill?
Have we received offers of assistance to help us through this budget challenge? The answer would be yes. And the calls that we have had and conversations that we have had with our stakeholders have been very encouraging. They understand the challenge that we have before us, and they are very open to having conversations about how they might be able to help us through this. We also had conversations with our stakeholders about the possibility of leveraging the existing resources that we have to shore up especially the academic services that we have, that we will still continue to offer, like for instance, tutoring services after school. So maybe we're not able to provide a lot of tutoring services to our students, but maybe these partners can, in partnership with us, to make sure that those tutoring services are aligned to our curriculum, and that the services that they provide the greatest impact with our students when they come back to school, the next day. And so, again, these conversations are in their initial early stages, but again, the folks we have talked to thus far have expressed an interest in exploring, both items, how they can help us through this challenge, but how we can also, partner to build stronger services for our students to help us through this crisis as well. And now when we talk about sustainability, as you well know, as board members, our ability to sustain programs that we have are a year-to-year discussion because we have to adopt an annual budget. And quite frankly, it's also dependent on every 2 years of what is done at the State House. And so our ability to sustain our programming that we have as a school district, I would say that we definitely should put on our traveling shoes, go over to the State House, and make that argument at the State House every 2 years that they need to better support not only Columbus City Schools, but all school districts across the state of Ohio, because public education is our future. And if we don't invest in our future, then we will always be stuck in the present and in the past.
Well, real quick follow-up. Well, I'm encouraged to hear that, some of our partners are looking to help us out. Will we, and I know we're in the early stages.
Yes.
Will that assistance be able to help us out with this current budget situation that we're in now in these initial conversations?
I think it's too early to tell right now. I think as we continue to have this dialogue with you as a Board of Education, as we continue to have dialogue with our partners, we'll see, where those conversations may go. And of course, we will definitely report back to the Board of Education if anything does develop from those conversations.
And I don't mean to pontificate, and I apologize. Just when I look over the list of these things, these are all important items. Everything here is important. Everything here helps our kids. So just remember that when the state continues to cut income taxes for people and they wonder why we haven't seen job growth, because that philosophy doesn't work. And that's all we've seen the state legislature do for the last 4 years, and then we're shocked when they see that they take it out of the backs of the education, public education, specifically Columbus. So, I'm looking forward to the next biennium budget, and I really hope that we can, do a better job, us as a board and the community, in advocating to the state legislature. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peretti. Mr. Superintendent, do you have a response to that particular?
Not a response. I just wanted to add on, I agree wholeheartedly with that statement, but I also wanted to make sure the board understood that, especially with some of our nonprofit partners, the investment that we make at the district level is a part of their ability to go to fundraisers and generate additional funding. Because a lot of times the funders want to make sure that we are making an investment as well, that we've got some skin in the game, if you will, with the investment for that particular program. And so, with one particular partner, we're making about $1 million investment, but, our kids are getting a tremendous amount of benefit from that partnership. And so, as you've already said, all of us, staff members, board members, community members, putting on our traveling shoes, walking down the street to the State House, and making that argument to our legislators when the time is appropriate is something that we have to do going forward.
Mr. Brown?
Yes, and thank you. I wanted to touch on really the same topic and some of the same partners that we're talking about. And I think that, I agree. These are really good and important programs. I hope that we can continue them, and yet they're not necessarily part of our core mission or our required mission. And for that reason, I think we need to take a hard look, maybe a harder look than we have, in talking with them and making sure that our partners understand the situation and that they start looking at developing capacity and building resources elsewhere that they can apply to fulfilling the role that they're fulfilling. Working with them, but it may mean reducing our share and strongly encouraging them to look to other sources. Some of them will have that ability, some of them will not. Don't want to single out any in particular, but I heard that City Year, for example, can perhaps be funded, that there's some federal funding that may be available to help them do that and be less reliant on our general fund dollars. Obviously we need to look hard at those things, and I see Ms. Gillison anxious to jump in.
Good evening. And when you mention a partner like City Year, before we even get to City Year, I just want to say that every partnership, every program, every personnel that is listed in here brings value to our program, to the district, to our kids, and to the community. So these decisions were very, very hard. And what we were tasked to do, it's hard to sit up here and talk about it because we're talking about lives, not only our kids' lives, but we're talking about our employee associations, we're talking about programs. But we sat down and had conversations with Tasha Booker from City Year. And now that you bring that up, and the conversations went really well because she understands the position that we're in, and she is willing to talk and try to leverage some other resources so that our young people can still reap the benefits. City Year touches approximately 4,000 of our young people in the space of academics, in the space of attendance, and the social emotional space. So our partners are willing to sit down and talk with us. So I'm really encouraged with that. It's hard, and I'm not going to pretend like it's not hard, because everything on here, I wish we could keep it, but the reality is we can't. So making this list and going back to the table, and you mentioned earlier when you talked about, our interests, and in academic services, I was like this, we can, yes, and our superintendent, our interim superintendent, and my colleagues, we had to make the hard decisions. And in making those hard decisions, we had to look to see what we could reduce but not eliminate, and then we went into seeing what we could realign or reallocate and look for other sources of income. So it wasn't easy, it's not easy, but I am encouraged that the team that we have care about our young people and care about the staff and all our employees here at Columbus City Schools.
And it may make for tough conversations with some of our partners, I understand that, but I think now's the time we have to have those tough conversations, whether it's I know I can, or City Year, or any of the others. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President? No? Ms. Gibbs?
Thank you. So since we're on page 1, I just would like to say, I think you've made some very difficult decisions, but I understand all of them. And because I read through the rest of the document, I understand we're making cuts in other places that will require us to still have strong community partnerships to help us fill in the gaps, especially for those non-academic barriers that I know our students will face. We have a number of long-time supportive partnerships, but we also have some that you are recommending to put on hold and through this budget process. And so I will also say, while we're only on page 1 and there's 22, 25 plus pages, that it will become evident, not on this page, I mean, this is the first one, but there are a number of supports and other very valued activities on both the administrative and the student side that will require us to keep something intact. We have to cut the budget, but we can't cut their lifeline. We're going to need something intact to keep them mentally, academically, physically, socially whole. And so I support this page. It's difficult, but if you want to hear not just objections, but supports, it's a difficult page, but I understand it. Let me say that. I understand it.
All right. Thank you for the reminder, Ms. Gibbs, that there are 22 pages in this document, and we're on page 1. So do we want to move on to page 2? And if you think it's easier to go by office, by page? Okay. All right, very good. Are we moving to page 2?
Yeah. Okay. And the reason why is it will facilitate the conversation because there's when we have a new office and program, it starts a new page. Okay. And so the next page, page 2, is academic services operations. And the budget items listed here support the operation of our programs and services that we offer, through the school district. And so there are things like professional development, for licensure. There are things like providing internet access and so on. And these are things that we consider to be sort of operational, if you will, in support of our academic services.
Questions on page 2, Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. One is a very small expenditure that I think is important. Our mission, something as our core mission was mentioned. Our mission as an organization is to ensure that each child is highly educated, prepared for leadership and service, and empowered for success as citizens in a global community. I think that mobile hotspots provide children the necessary access where needed, where they have materials online that they may need for class. I have personal experience with this as a parent in the district. Were it not for our ability to be blessed to have any number of screens at home, I often think that when my children may take advantage of that at times, that there are so many that don't have that as an advantage. To me, was there a measurement that was utilized? Is there something you're looking at, or you just totally looked at it as operational? What is it that brought this for recommendation to be cut? And it's a very small expenditure. I mean, in the greater scheme of things, it's incredibly small.
I'm going to turn to Chief Academic Officer Alicia Gillison to respond.
Thank you, and thank you for that question. When we're talking about the mobile hotspots, and let's talk about return on investment, and you're talking about it being a small expenditure, I think what's important is the mobile hotspots that we're talking about here are only for our gifted population. So it's not for every student to be able to access the internet in places other than school. It is only for our gifted population. and we reduced and we did not eliminate. I think that's important.
So this represents a reduction.
Absolutely.
This does not recommend a cut.
It represents a reduction, not an elimination.
Well, one is I think it'll be helpful to maybe have some sort of column that gives us a deeper understanding of what is a reduction versus an absolute cut. Secondly, I still think that our gifted population of students, something that we're doing very well at as a district, I still think that they deserve this access to this resource as well.
I would not argue with you that our students deserve the access. I like where you're going with that. But as we kind of discussed earlier, there were some decisions that had to be made. And with this one, because of the importance, it was reduced as opposed to eliminated.
Board Member Reyes?
You need this.
So to that extent, Mrs. Gillison, so I see a lot of professional development. So I don't know if this is, again, a reduction or a full cut. We talk about being current, we talk about being up to date, we talk about the importance, not only as a board for professional development, but obviously as a district for professional development. So I'd be very curious to know how many of these are cuts, and maybe that's why some of them are smaller than others. The other thing that I think it's important for us to know as we're going through here is when you're talking about rate of return, if I'm investing $200,000 for a benefit to 20 kids, that's going to be a large rate of return because that's a small group if they're moving forward. If I'm talking about $100,000 for 200 kids, that's going to automatically almost make it a lower rate of return. So it doesn't make it easy for us to look at. I think it goes back to Board Member Brown's question when we were talking about when you're fitting them into those 4 quadrants, depending on your evaluation tool and the number of people times your cost, I'm not a mathematician, but times your cost, will move or shift where that priority would go. So, and I'm hoping, I'm making the assumption that you took that into consideration, but when I look at some of these, some of them may say 20 students. To the recent question's point, if you're taking about a mobile hotspot of, and I'm just throwing a number out there, 10 students and we're paying $42.50, then yeah, I'm going to say that's probably a reasonable cut. I know it doesn't cost that much, but I think that context would be desirable for us. When we're talking about partnerships also, there's a couple classes, the outreach course at OSU. Is that tuition reimbursement on behalf of the district, or is that,
What is the context?
you know, what, is that teachers are not eligible to apply for financial aid if they need it? Are they not eligible to apply for scholarships? Is this something that we've promised teachers? That's in the middle of the page, right, actually right underneath mobile hotspots. So that's a $174,000 cut of OSU courses that teachers can take to acquire additional licenses or endorsements. I think in past years we've talked about how proud we are that we have very highly qualified, certified, licensed teachers. What is the impact? I mean, it says here not required, and I do see the rate of return is high. Are there other avenues for that? And I know I'm not letting you answer here because I think that's rhetorical, but one question that I would like to know a little bit more about is on the SS printing. It does say that by law, all parents must be provided a copy of their IEP ETR. There's no way of making that a consent form and having them have access to it to reduce cost? I mean,
Yes, by law, we have to put it in the
put
mail.
it in paper?
I do want to bring go back to the outreach courses.
Yes.
Very, very valuable. And the return on the investment is high. And once again, this is an area where we reduced as opposed to eliminated. And there was a 36% reduction in that area.
If I may, I'd like to also add that, that even though it is rated as a high return on investment, it's not required
Correct.
that we provide that type of service. And so again, this is a part of that tough decision-making that we had to do as a senior leadership team, weighing those things that are mandated versus those things that are not mandated, even though we get a high return on investment from it. And so I believe during our discussions, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe during our discussions on this particular item in other districts, those type of courses and fees are paid by the teachers themselves, not by the district.
And I think that's what my question was, whether there's an opportunity. I don't want it lost. Again, we pride ourselves in having highly qualified teachers. That's why when we go out in the community, I'm super proud to say we have the best teachers in the whole nation. And that's because they have the opportunity to be highly certified and educated and so forth. So I think there's an opportunity for us to help them get tuition reimbursement or some other avenues. And I think my question was, were we paying it because we had that, and we had not negotiated that, but we had made a district-wide choice to say, if you're willing to take this, we will pay for it.
Correct. And if I can add, this is our first introduction of this information to you as board members. And so please feel free to ask those questions. And if we don't have the answer in front of us, we will definitely get answers back to you as a part of this process that we're going to engage with you over the next month or so. And so, again, this is a lot of information. We've got hundreds of budget items that we have considered to present this information to you today. And so, again, please be patient with us if we don't have the answers in front of us right now, but we will definitely get the answers to you afterwards.
A couple more questions. And that's why it says maybe some of my comments are rhetorical, not necessarily that you have to give me the answer right back as you're considering it. I know in my discussions with a couple of our teachers, I see here support of smart boards across the district. Is there an alternative for support of our smart boards that's going into future technology and 21st century learning? So if our teachers are not being trained appropriately or smart boards are not working, I'm assuming that's a reduction and not an elimination.
You are absolutely correct. That is a reduction as opposed to elimination. But when we talk about finding other sources, because our schools have budgets, and if you have a smart board that goes down or needs a bulb or anything like that, then our schools can absorb that.
And then one more, and then I'll defer to the rest of my colleagues. Concerning for me that food for pre-K classrooms is not required, and that's a low rate of return. So are we saying we're not feeding our babies?
Or is this a reduction?
And is there an alternative, or does that mean like they're getting food somewhere else? So right at number 4, it's that first line, says food for pre-K classrooms recommended for a reduction cost of $10,712. So that means they don't get to eat?
That is a reduction and not an elimination.
Do we have alternatives? I mean, instead of getting a full meal, they just get an apple, or what? I don't want to be facetious.
This was actually a budget line that our Director of Early Childhood Education was looking at, and this is not something that our buildings use. Our pre-K students participate in the regular school breakfast and lunch, just like all of the other students in the schools. This was a line item that for some reason had been in this budget historically, and so with that notion that it's just not being used, we went ahead and eliminated that and used that as a cost savings.
I wanted to make sure someone didn't see that and assume, just like me, that we're not feeding our kids.
K student is going to go hungry.
Thank you. I'll defer to my colleagues.
Ms. Gibbs?
Yes, thank you so much. Board Member Reyes touched on this, but I didn't hear maybe a clear-cut answer. Again, back to the idea that we need to cut and we need to balance our budget, but we also expect to move forward academically. And we still want to move up. We want more students to pass the third grade guarantee. We want more students to graduate. We want more students passing our tests. So while I support the elimination of the cost of PD, how are you planning to provide professional development, and what exactly are you going to talk about? How are we going to get it done with these cuts? Because it's still important that we have teachers that are knowledgeable on current trends, best practices, so that we can move forward. So I understand the cut, but what is the plan to
continue professional development and continue having teachers that are highly qualified. It's looking at alternative funding sources and then looking at the expertise within the district.
So if I could elaborate a little bit more, all of our schools this coming school year will receive Title I funds, except for Clinton Elementary School. And so those funds could be used for additional professional development training at the building level that is really narrowly designed for the needs of the students in that particular building. We also, from a district level, I would say for the last 3 or 4 years, we have been really focused on our own people providing professional development based on their expertise and based on their experiences in the classroom. And those offerings have been very popular among our teachers because they're listening from their colleagues and they're learning from their colleagues in a professional learning community environment.
I understand that, but we still have a very high student mobility rate. So if you are in building A and you have PD from that team catered to building A, but next year you end up in building B, how is that student still well served by the PD if building A and building B's PD are totally different and they're not at the same level?
Well, because most of our PD is centered around broad topics, if you will, around climate and culture, around instructional practices. And so it's not narrowly designed for that particular school based on the pedagogic approaches at that particular school. A lot of our professional development is around broad topics, around the use of, say, project-based learning. And so, you know, that type of professional development won't impede a student who is moving from one school building to the next school building.
So much along the line of Board Member Peretti around partnerships, I agree with train the trainer. I agree with using our internal expertise. But if we all had it, we will already be where we want it to be. So I hope in this area we lean on our partnerships as well to leverage their resources, use alternative resources to make sure we continue to bring new thoughts, new ideas, new practice, new pedagogies, so that we don't become stagnant and that our students then stay in place instead of move. So I hope we are creative around that. My second question, I know we can cut anywhere, and the stroke of the pen is to get to the number, right? So you took a big, huge pen, but my question now is around the library recommendations and around the spaces and the maker spaces for what the library team needs to be successful. Could you tell me if these are cuts or reductions? And I know we can use title funds for classrooms. What resources do our library, and I think they're called library sciences and library multimedia team, what resources can they tap into? And can they tap into Title I dollars to help with these, or are they simply general fund?
Thank you for that question. And let's look at the PD for the library staff. I want to share that's a reduction and not an elimination, okay? Because we take professional development very seriously in this district, and just kind of piggybacking off of what Dr. Stanford talked about, when we think about quality instruction and we think about our priorities in the district and the strategic action plan that we have resources focused around those. So when you talk about K-3 literacy, when we're talking about graduation, when we're talking about culture and climate, and you brought up something, Board Member Gibbs, we're not there yet. We're not there yet, and we do have some very difficult decisions to make, but please understand that collectively we have deliberated over these decisions, but this is the beginning of a journey, and it's our hope that collaboratively we will get input from just about every stakeholder so that we can make clearer decisions for our young people and for our community.
Thank you.
Any other questions from board members on page 2? Page 3.
Is academic services, transportation. And these budget items are transportation services that are provided in support of our academic programming.
Questions? Ms. Gibbs?
Just a quick question. Transportation to events in the amount of $61,000, to events both during the day and after school. Does this reduction eliminate field trips and transportation of field trips, or cut a reduction? Maybe.
So transportation for events on this page, it is a reduction and not an elimination,
Thank you.
because it's still about the experience for our young people.
So we are not cutting out field trips for all kids in Columbus City Schools?
That particular budget line is very specific to Unified Arts and some of the events that some schools might participate, but not all. And so looking at if we have those continue with those district events, we would need buildings or their support organizations to then find the funds for
Absorb
those
that.
transportation. So we as a district aren't paying for those.
Thank you.
Page 4.
Page 4 is academic services programs, and as you see, it covers page 4, 5, and page 6. And so this particular set of line items covers 3 pages. But what you will find in those 3 pages are various academic programs that we are providing to our students across the district to support the academic growth and enrichment of our students.
Questions on pages 4, 5, and 6, Ms. Gibbs?
Yes. Starting on page 4, we're talking about the dues for student professional organizations. Does that include National Honor Society, national other societies? Tell me exactly what that entails.
Thanks, Ms. Gibbs. This is actually very specific to Career Tech. These are the student organizations that we're required to enroll those students who are in particular programs into those organizations so they can participate in competitions throughout the school year.
And your recommendation is to keep them?
Yes, where it's a requirement.
Thank you. My next question then is around the recommendations to the supplies for the LD and the ED classrooms. They're very small amounts, but I would simply say reconsider those.
Yes, those are also reductions, not full
Okay,
eliminations,
not full
just so
cuts.
that we could continue to support those classrooms, but just be very judicious in the things we're purchasing for those classrooms.
Okay, and in this section is Woodcrest. And what is written here is the cost of intercession for the year-round program. My question is, and I want to make sure I understand what is recommended. Are we recommending moving Woodcrest to a traditional calendar? And would it be possible to keep Woodcrest with a reduced amount of intercessions? I know it's a critical part of their programs, but if we eliminated these intercessions, does that mean they can't operate year-round? Help me understand the recommendation around Woodcrest.
The recommendation is for Woodcrest to be on a traditional schedule. So I'm not quite certain that I understand what you're asking around the intercessions.
So the line item says supports the cost of intercession for their year-round program, and it eliminates that. So my question is, could it exist without intercession with the year-round calendar?
The whole purpose of Woodcrest being on a year-round calendar is to provide those slightly longer intercessions instead of having, how long is our summer vacation? Is that about 2.5 months almost? Instead of having that long of a gap between when a quarter would start and when a quarter would end, to have a slightly smaller group of time than that, but a little larger than a spring break or a winter break, because you can provide a good couple weeks of intervention, of enrichment, where we're bringing staff in. Those days when students are on intercession are extended days beyond our teachers and our administrators' contract times, and so that's why we have to provide that extended service pay for teachers who are working during intercession, as well as our principal who is working during intercession, because that goes beyond her contractual days as well. And so, and transportation costs as well, as Ms. Gillison just said, because those are days that it might be that only Woodcrest buses are on the road rather than when our whole fleet is on the road, and so that's going to be an additional cost there. Could we look at providing some sort of enrichment or intervention during the summer months if they were on a traditional calendar but still on a traditional calendar but still provided some of those opportunities? Sure, but that's what we do already with all of our buildings.
So I guess my question is there a way to keep them as a year-round school if we reduced one intercession? Or is intercession required to operate a school on a year-round calendar?
That's a good question. No, it's not required. So we could look at what the cost impact would be to just reduce those intercessions. We haven't done that calculation necessarily, but we could look at that.
So they could stay the way they are, but no intercessions. And then I would want to see a cost per breakdown if they were to keep maybe one intercession, if they were able to pick when their intercession was and to keep their calendar intact, what would that be? And are those 3 intercessions, they come up to a cost of $500,000, so it's nothing to sneeze at, but if they were able to keep their year-round calendar and maybe reduce the number of intercessions, could you just come back to us at a later date and tell us what that would be?
I'd like to look at the cost of those various intercessions, as well as the impact it's going to have academically in a short amount of time in one of those intercessions. How much gains can we make versus when we have the students participating in all 3? So that'd be two pieces of data we'd need to look at.
I think that would be interesting. They are the last of our 3 year-round schools, which were Wyland Park and I believe Afrocentric, and they have continued to be an amazing program. And so before we in fact, eliminate a choice, which is an offering, which also appears in our lottery choices. It's not choosing a traditional school. You're choosing a school, a program, and a special calendar. So before we eliminate that offering for parents, I would want to explore all of the ways we could still find those cost savings and keep some part of that special program intact. But you could bring that data back at a later time. That's all, President.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. President. I see here in somewhat of the same section here, some reductions in science. Something, for example, probeware. We've made considerable I'm looking at page 6. I'm sorry about that. Looking at page 6. There are some recommended either reductions, and I'd like to get clarity on whether these are reductions or not, or exact cuts. For example, Solution for Science licenses, License for Science resource. This is a $50,000 reduction or cut. So I'd like to get an idea of what this represents. More importantly, again, what the takeaway is from the classroom. We've made considerable expenditures over the last 4 years on software technology that give our teachers and our students improved, access to teaching and learning in the classroom environment. What do these reductions represent, or if they are reductions or cost cuts, what do they represent in terms of impact to the classroom?
Board Member Cole, I'll start with probeware, because that's science-related, and in your statement, you talked about that we have made considerable investments in science and in those technologies.
Across the board for teaching our question, I'm just specifically looking at this and several other line items.
Right, so in relation to science, so our science classrooms and our secondary science classrooms and elementary science classrooms have been outfitted with technologies, and our secondary classrooms with probeware. So now if there is anything additional needed, there are schools, and Dr. Stanford kind of talked about all of our schools, with the exception of Clinton Elementary Schools, having title dollars so that the school can kind of absorb
Okay.
some of those costs. So our kids won't go without, but we have to look at alternative funding sources to provide, to continue to provide or repair in those areas.
But these represent, again, reductions, yes? Or all-out cuts?
Probeware, an all-out cut, and the
Okay.
schools will have to absorb.
And again, the solution for science licenses, what is that line item? And
Yeah, I'd want to get a best description from our Director of Secondary Education, Cherie Wells, so you have a good understanding of what that is. I know that's a package that's been used for the last couple of years. The license has expired this year, so the decision was just made not to renew that license should we need to make that, that reduction.
Okay, I'd just like to make sure we just have a better understanding. I know, for example, Blackboard, that we've had conversation over the past year about Blackboard and found a supplemental resource that's free to be able to replace that. So it'll be helpful to give us some sort of greater context, if you will, so that we understand and we don't waste time. Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes, thank you. I just have, I think, a few questions. First, what is CCP?
College credits, that's our dual enrollment program.
Okay. There were, I guess, a number of items that were considered but not recommended, the largest one being the tuition itself. Are there reductions in here or not at all? And is there room here to provide some reductions?
When we look at just the programs itself, there are several things that we as a team looked at, considered, decided not to make any reduction, not to make any elimination. They are stand as is, CCP being one that is required by the state of Ohio and the Ohio Department of Education, so we can't eliminate that one.
Okay.
It's good. So that's a standard one. There are several line items that are, we know that our reductions we've made, we may have made a 25% reduction just to save some dollars here and there, trying to trim some things a little bit, and then several things that are fully eliminated just because of not seeing that return on investment. So I think that's something we've heard from the table, probably a data point that we need to add in to give some clarity for everyone.
Thank you. Achieve 3,000. Again, it's a significant item. And considered but not recommended. What is this? And it looks like it's a new program. And perhaps because it's a new program, what we're going to do is take a hard look at it and decide whether to continue after it's completed.
You're absolutely correct. We're in the first year of a 2-year contract, so we will look at the results and the return on the investment.
Okay.
Achieve
Not
3,000. Yeah, that's one of the interventions that we purchased probably 2 or 3 board meetings ago for secondary reading instruction and for reading intervention. So working with all of our secondary students who are below grade level in reading.
So this one is essentially too soon to really evaluate ROI. Okay. On page 5, obviously the largest item in this batch, the $5.9 million item for extracurricular athletics. Yeah, it's a big number, and it's a very big activity. Are there areas where we can affect some savings in extracurricular activities that makes sense for us to consider? Nobody's anxious to eliminate these things. We know the value that they provide to our young people and to the community. But you know, are we taking a sufficiently creative look at this kind of activity?
And Board Member Brown, the answer to that question would be yes, we are. As a matter of fact, we received a suggestion today in the superintendent's mailbox on how we could look at things creatively when it comes to athletics. Eliminating athletics, that would kill the program, kill the district, and kill our young people's experience. But taking a different look at what we could do differently, that is something that we're exploring right now.
And if I may, wholeheartedly agree that we do need to take a creative look at all of these items. But in particular with athletics and with the arts and with music, these are things that add so much tremendous
Absolutely.
value to the learning experience of our students and really goes to educating the whole child and making sure that we have well-rounded citizens that we graduate from our schools. And so, again, we definitely want to take a creative look at them and see if there are opportunities to be more efficient and effective. But again, the word came up of eliminating. I, for one, would be very, very strongly advocating that we don't eliminate those type of programs like music, like the arts, and like athletics.
And I understand that. I don't disagree. I'm not saying that, I value these things too. But as we're going through this process of trying to trim, sometimes, I guess, would apply to everything in here. When forced, people tend to do creative things and figure out solutions. And for some of these items, that may be exactly where we are.
Yeah, we're on the same page.
Yep,
Okay.
we're on the same page.
Yeah.
Mr. Peretti?
I apologize. I know that we did have a lot of conversations beforehand on how this looked and what to expect. Maybe just like at the end of each section, as well as adding that column, like, is this an elimination or just a reduction, something that illustrates that, but at the same time, maybe a summary at the end of each section, kind of like a sum of the amount of dollars, so we can just sort of kind of look and be able to kind of go back and forth, just for people. I do not. That's it, though.
And if I may, I'd like to have a little bit more clarity around that suggestion because, we did discuss that, and one of the reasons why we did not, put a total is because with this being a spreadsheet, we have recommended items and items that were considered.
Yeah.
And so if we did a total of that entire column, it would not be an accurate description of those recommended items because it would also include the considered items. So
Maybe just recommend.
just recommended?
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
And then, I don't know how, if you put the whole line item budget, or if you just indicate that it's a reduction or complete elimination, whatever works, that we can get a good
Yeah.
feeling
That's
for
easy.
what it actually is going on.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Board Member Reyes?
Thank you. Going back to the STEM question, the defined learning, so obviously all of us are very aware that Northland has been a very outstanding STEM program. It says it has a high rate of return, not necessarily required, but I'm sure Northland folk will tell you different. I'm assuming this is a reduction, and if so, can this be covered by Title I dollars? Or is it way out of the realm?
This is considered an elimination totally from the district budget, but it is something that would be title allowable, so buildings could use title funds to do that.
Then my second question is, I see a lot of, or at least a big chunk of Chromebook recommended here. I know from seeing other districts and what they have and hearing from our teachers about what we don't have, how would we substitute getting Chromebooks otherwise?
These specific light items were single one-time purchases for specific buildings. So the academic services doesn't allocate dollars for just general technology purchases. These were ones where a specific building came to teaching and learning, said, this is a need we have right now, can you help cover this? It's not something we planned or budgeted ahead of time for. So that would just be a one-time purchase that we would just be able to eliminate those costs then from our budget and planning.
Okay. And I don't also see that we're still buying a couple textbooks. We still got some text in here, support to purchase supplemental text for ELL students and so forth. Is that because we are going digital on those?
Those supplemental textbooks would be a reduction, and those are just if there is a particular resource that a particular building was needing for its ELL services. And the same with special education in providing students access to the general curriculum. Those would just be reduction areas.
And then, I just want to make sure. That's not it. And that's the same thing for the AP Calculus and Pre-Calculus textbooks?
That was a line item that they had identified for this year to purchase pre-calc and calculus textbooks for this current school year, so we don't need that line item going forward.
Okay, so one-time purchase. Okay. Those are my questions.
Board Member Gibbs?
So along the same lines, very quickly, as we're talking about the library books, the new library books for schools, and the updated literature, there's a significant recommendation of $200,000. Is that a cut or a reduction? Page 5.
That would be a reduction.
To be reduced by 200,000. Would that reduction still allow for a book refresh in our libraries, or would they just hold with what we have?
We'd just do a hold, purchase some new resources for libraries, but certainly not be able to do the refresh. The refreshes would be on hold for now. And until this funding issue is stabilized just a little more and we have the funding stream to be able to begin the refreshes again.
So you spoke to a strategy where some of these dollars or some of these reductions can be absorbed within the building's title dollars. But that's a whole lot to absorb into your building title dollars. So what instruction or what guidance are we giving building principals so that we understand how they're going to use them, and to ensure that, in fact, while they could absorb PD and speakers and this or that we understand what the ratio to student services versus administrative support will be used at the building level? How do we monitor that? And then how do we measure whether or not that's beneficial to us meeting our goals?
Sure. To answer the first part of your question, again, we're still at the initial stages of this process. And so as we continue to have this dialogue and have this conversation, and if, that type of item is a good candidate for the board to identify for a reduction, then we will have those conversations, with our teams so that we can help them develop strategies to deal with whatever potential reductions that the board will adopt going forward. And so, we're already thinking about what those strategies may be, but as you start to make more decisions, then we'll be able to start honing in our resources to make sure that we have those strategies in place working with our building leadership teams. The second part of your question is that our executive directors for school leadership are constantly working with our building leaders and their leadership teams to assess and monitor the programming that is going on in their buildings with their building leadership teams, who are made up of community members and with teachers, to identify those necessities and those needs at their particular buildings.
So let me ask one more question around, just in general, as we're talking about buildings and we're talking about title dollars, they are, if I'm right, in proportion to the number of students in your building that are eligible for title dollars, right? Or priority funds. I mean, we are priority schools, get another set of funding. But if your school does not have a lot of students that qualify, everybody doesn't get the same title amount. So for those buildings that aren't high poverty, because not all of our buildings are high poverty, they have a smaller pool to use. How do we provide equity to those students, even though they're not economically as disadvantaged as our other buildings? How do we then provide equitable support?
So, in terms of making sure that we're providing equity, that is a constant issue that we're monitoring and observing from a district level in terms of the resources that are being allocated out to our buildings from the central office. Now, of course, in these sort of tight budget challenges, making sure that that equity is being achieved is much more of a challenge, right? And we have to we have to support our principals in those buildings to look for outside grant opportunities. And so that's why we have a grant position in the budget office that work with our building principals to identify grant opportunities that may be out there and available for them to help with those type of equity issues. But again, I hate to keep beating a live horse, but the bottom line is to help us ensure that equity is being achieved across the district is also a responsibility of those folks on the corner of High and Broad Street, because of the money that we are supposed to be getting back from the state will help us, provide that sort of equity across the board, looking at the type of resources that we have available to us. And so when those type of decisions are made at the corner of Broad and High Street, it makes our job difficult to provide that equity for our students.
Thank you.
Mr. Peretti?
If I might add, I would also, when we talk about equity, that's reaching back out to our community partners and seeing where the shortfalls are and where they would be willing to step in and help our schools and help our children.
Mr. Peretti?
Thank you, President Baker. Under academic services and programs, we are seeing a lot of physical items. Now, I know a lot of these physical items don't have a shelf life of 5 years, which would make it eligible for other revenue streams, like if we were to sell another building that we don't like. I mean, do we have other buildings that we could sell? I guess my question is, out of these recommended lists on academic services, and this will be some of my other comments, what can be consolidated into capital purchases that would take it out of the GRF dollars across the board through this document? And how could we leverage some of the swing space, administrative buildings that we have that we could consolidate? We have a huge campus at Fort Hays, and some may disagree with me. I've always been a fan of consolidating a lot of our buildings and locating on Fort Hays. How much is our building worth on State Street? What of these dollars then can be used for a lot of these things that could be slid over to capital purchases that have a shelf life of longer than 5 years? I really hope we're looking at those sort of things and having those conversations, because I see a lot of things here that could easily be capital. And now with the sale of building funds, the $500,000 that we now have for the permanent improvement, I know we've been working really hard on this internally on getting a annual budget of not only our $500,000 permanent improvement, which can be used for capital, our .84 mils that we got for the levy for deferred maintenance, and our sale of the building funds. Those 3 buckets right there. Yes, I know we're doing really good with Operation Fix It, but we need to start looking forward, just for transparency for us, and so everyone's above line. I would really like to see there are a lot of items in here to me. Our Chromebook carts, $79,000. Could that be slid into capital? I don't know. I think it can be, just based on my general knowledge. And I just hope that we are looking at options like shedding what we don't need and using those dollars then to fill this hole.
So I'd like to take the first stab at this in terms of laying or setting the stage for my colleagues who are much more well-versed on this than I am to provide you an answer. And I know I saw some pointing going back and forth across the room here, so I think they've already figured out who's going to tag team to answer this question for you. But let me just say in general that my knowledge of it is limited as well. But if my recollection is correct, there is a difference between, the sale of buildings and what those dollars can be used for versus if we've got a bond or a permanent improvement where the resources are being used from those resources. And so,
From my understanding, it's all capital. So
Well-
whether it's sale of building or if it's bond dollars, it can be used for buildings and/or things with a shelf life of 5 years or more.
I would say give us the opportunity to go back and look at the statutes to make sure that that is the case, because again, in the back of my head, the sale of buildings I thought had a little bit different language around that. But either way, the point that you're making is, are there opportunities from capital improvement dollars to invest in non-building items? The answer to that is yes in general, as long as those things have a shelf life of more than 5 years. So again, textbooks, school buses, technology, computers, actual, computers are some of those things. And I think at that point, I'm going to turn it over to our budget director, who might be able to lend a little bit more light on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, and as Dr. Stanford mentioned, yes, we can do that, but the caution will be, just as we did with this, that there were levy promises about those capital funding sources that we voted in for the Operation Fix-It.
That's one pot of money.
Right.
But we do have other
But there's the very
opportunities.
specific piece there of projects that we did. The PI component of that was to look at deferred maintenance. So we have a project schedule in place, so what we'd have to do is go back and we'd have to reprioritize those. Because and I'm just using this as a number, say we take $5 million and we're going to move it from here over into the capital funds, whether it's the sale of building or the PI fund, we're going to have to go back and look at the plan that the capital improvements team has in place and figure out, are there some projects that we have kind of in the pipeline that we might need to move back a little bit to slot this in? Well, we can do that, but we'll have to go back to the drawing board, because with that, there is only so much money that we have. The piece that's new to that is, as we have facilities that we can put on the market and sell, then those are new dollars that can come in, and then we'd obviously want to reinvest those and put those into the plan to pay for those projects, whether we move some things up or move them back, but we'd have to look at that.
I agree. I just think that we have to be creative with this. How much is the State Street building worth? I know it's one-time money. A lot of this stuff doesn't cascade through the years. But, if we can find some relief, for our classrooms, not cutting materials, not cutting all that. I haven't heard a single thing in any of this that I want to get rid of. Sorry. I don't feel, that's how I feel. That's all very important. So then we need to start as a board, we need to really consider those other options. And that is how much of this, and I understand that capital doesn't cascade through the years, but it does take off some of the relief. It does put ourselves in a better position for the future. We are looking underneath every rock. That building on State Street, it doesn't even have fire alarms, does it? So, come on. So I really want us to take a hard look at that. That's the way of thinking I think that we need to really start to position ourselves with. On this right here that I've been looking at, I'm seeing a lot of things that I think can be slid in to capital. I am not an expert, but I would like us to look at that and discover that.
Mr. Treasurer?
My only comment is, don't sell yourself short. Because as a board and as an administrative team, you've done that. It started back in 2016 as we planned for the three-part levy, a bond issue, a permanent improvement, and an operating levy. And we had Mr. Oldham drawn and quartered numerous times to stretch him out to figure out how much can we pull out of an operations budget and pull it over into a capital budget, and identifying not $125 million worth of deferred maintenance, which was what the size of the bond issue was, but well over $200 or $300 million worth of deferred maintenance. So don't sell yourself short. You have been creative, if you will, and you have gone through your operating budget. And we pulled, at that point in time, the objective was to keep the operating millage down. And we, moved those dollars over to capital, and we funded it in part through a PI, which is a good idea. I'll tell you, in my personal opinion, the PI was not large enough, but that's, you get what you ask for, you can always go back. And as I just said, the bond issue was easily half of what we really needed to do the catch-up on deferred maintenance. So I'm just saying, I want to give you the board credit and give us credit for we have done that in trying to reallocate capital-related items over to capital funds. And I think that was part of the marketing package, if you will, of that whole levy campaign. And it made sense to everyone, and because it does make sense. So we've done a lot of that. So as I think what Scott was saying nicely, and I probably won't say so nicely, that is, as you want to identify more capital items to put over into the capital funds, we already have more capital needs than what's over there, and you're going to shift them over. Something has to move. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm just reminding you that we've been through that.
We have done that, and I agree. We've done a fantastic job at that. I'm looking at new opportunities. Not of what we've done already, and we have done a lot. Is there anything else? Like I said, the State Street building, have we had that conversation? No. So I'm just putting it out there because I think it's important. We've done a really good job. We have been very creative with that. I just cringe when I see the cuts. I know that they're doing things, and it's our job to to continue to prod and ask questions. And I do appreciate everything, but I just want to make sure that we are looking underneath every rock, every stone for opportunities. Because quite frankly, I like the partnerships ideas. They're great. I worry about sustainability with a lot of things too. That's a fear of mine. We'll have it for 2-3 years and it's gone. So we do a really good job at stuff. Yes, I want to do partnerships and stuff, but I'm just seeing a lot of capital in here. Are there other areas are there other administrative buildings? Have we gotten around to all the buildings that we say that are surplus that we could sell? Those are the sort of things. What's left is what I would be really interested in seeing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peretti. Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Thank you. And I just want to,
Before Mr. Brown.
Pardon? Just a minute. I believe Mr. Oldham had a comment. I apologize, Mr.
okay.
Oldham. Yes, sir.
If I could add, I just wanted to piggyback on what Boardman Peretti was speaking of. We are looking at creative ways with our PI side of the dollars or other capital dollars. One of the things you talked earlier about Chromebooks and what would happen. One of the reasons we're able to move in the direction we're moving in now is because over the years, our IT department has been outfitting our schools with Chromebook carts. And so now we have Chromebook carts in all of our schools. And so with that being said, we're able to move dollars off the general fund ledger. But also, in order to keep moving forward, we have also looked at other capital funding source of dollars. So how we can still look at technology items to keep moving forward. So I just want to touch bases on that. And then as Treasurer Bohoric mentioned, on the PI side and the deferred maintenance, no, the dollar's not where we need because we know it's over plus $200+ million. However, as we start addressing and attacking some of those deferred maintenance items, our goal is we start moving towards a preventive maintenance model opposed to a reactive model. So by doing that, we're able to also look at our dollars, be able to stretch those further, and be able to also, by doing that, looking at capital dollars and putting dollars back in the general fund side. So that's the direction we're looking to move in.
And I just want to be, just to clarify my position, I understand that the PI piece and the deferred maintenance piece that we asked for is pretty much dedicated to the over $400 million that we have in deferred maintenance. I get that. I'm talking about the sale building funds. Are there any others that we could possibly examine? And given the example I must have said 3 or 4 times now, the State Street building, I don't care where we meet. I want to make sure that we can meet, but if we got to make sure that, those are the sort of the conversations that we need to be having. What else can be shifted? That's my concern. I do know, and I want to make sure that we stay on pace when it comes to the deferred maintenance piece and the PI piece. Absolutely. That's the last thing I want to do is see us diverting roof replacements for Chromebooks, you know what I mean? But I understand that. But I just want to make sure that we are looking at everything else that may still be out there on the administrative building level, and how can that be sort of shifted if there are any other possibilities, like the State Street building, like any other buildings. Are there any compounds? What else is out there? That's where I'm more thinking, more focused on for us, essentially. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Brown?
Thank you. I don't want to repeat the things that Mr. Peretti just explained, but I agree with much of his comments and questions, and I'm glad that we had this discussion. I just want to take it a little bit farther. Certainly to the extent that we have any surplus property that is not being used, we ought to take a hard look at disposing of that, and those dollars, we'll have to make a decision at the time whether to put those into those deferred maintenance or buildings, or whether to use them in this other fashion. And those are one-time things. But we also need to take a look, and it's not too soon, to take a hard look at the facilities we have that we are using, and somebody didn't like that idea.
It's probably me. It always seems to be.
Yeah, where we can consolidate, where we can right-size the district. Because in doing that, not only do we potentially realize some capital dollars that are one-time, but that also allows us to look at operational dollars by consolidating, by being more efficient, and that can affect tremendous savings year after year after year. I've seen it work and do precisely that elsewhere, and I think that, as I say, it's not too soon for us to look at that, for multiple reasons.
And if I may, you'll see later on in the document entries for building administration buildings and for school buildings. And it's our strong recommendation as a senior leadership team that we use 2018 to develop a process and to go through that process to do that type of review of our entire portfolio of buildings across the district, so that we can have recommendations by the end of August, beginning of September, that the board can consider in preparation for the new lottery season that will start in January of 2019, and also for the next budget cycle, which would be for the 1920 FY fiscal year budget. We do, absolutely.
Well, to that point, I just also want to say we spent a tremendous amount of time updating our facilities master plan under the leadership of Board Member Peretti and I. So that analysis has been done. It could be updated and refreshed. But if you wanted to know who's up next, we have a document, and I wouldn't want to tie up our administration time going backwards on something we've already completed. It would just be a matter of when are we in position to look at it, and if we're willing to, or when will be the right time under the recommendation of administration to begin to move on the items that we've already spent a considerable amount of not just board, but community stakeholder and support to do. So I just, if we're weighing in comments, I would say there's some wheels we don't need to reinvent with that. We did everything except for, no, I think we did district non-academic buildings, but I agree with that. But if our final piece on administration is on page 7 for academic services and personnel, I want to talk about, and maybe you can tell me, is it still a requirement for our high school students to have 120 internship hours to graduate?
Yes, that is still a district requirement for our seniors.
Okay, our recommendation is for us to considerably reduce the number of career and community coordinators that we have. We know it is a critical part of one of our high schools, much like how Woodcrest has a unique design. It is a unique design to one of our other high schools, and it has become an essential part to others. How would we help our students meet their requirements if we reduce this significant number of coordinators? How would we get it done without them?
That's a great question. And as we started the conversation, all of these reductions or eliminations, is specifically when it comes to personnel, it's going to hurt. And when we think about how it can be absorbed, either in the buildings via the counselors or working with our career tech department on how we can still ensure that our kids are earning their 120 internship hours for graduation, because that is a graduation requirement.
So this is a reduction, not an elimination? Because they're not, some are considered, not all are eliminated. So we are reducing the
We're
number.
reducing the number of our CCRCs. We are not eliminating the CCRCs totally.
Okay. And we're going from how many to how many?
I think we're
Going from 11 to 3.
From 11 to 3. So we're proposing, so Columbus Alternative High School has an entire program designed, an entire school day, for needing a internship coordinator, because they go out for a full day, right? Juniors and seniors. But for the other high schools, all up there, they're going to have to share 3 people?
Yeah, and that's something that we will be working with our career tech department with. But you're right, and just as COS has that program, Eastmore Academy also has that program for their seniors on Thursdays to go out. So that is definitely something that we have to look at. Once again, none of these reductions or eliminations were easy, but there were some hard decisions that had to be made.
So,
We've moved to page 7 and 8 at this point, it sounds like. All right, any other questions? Yes, Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is on the same page of number 7. I also had questions again, much early on, around page 1 about this same issue. But I want to go a little further down the page and look at our teachers on special assignment. Can you explain what a teacher on special assignment is, how that process works, and ultimately what this proposed either reduction or loss, and it looks like a loss, is going to be for our classrooms? This is where the rubber is starting to hit the road for me, particularly as it relates to teaching and learning in our class, and what our children have to their avail, and what our teachers have to their avail to do their jobs effectively. What's going to be the impact of this? Explain TOSAs to us.
Sure. Let's talk specifically about the TOSAs that work in our curriculum office, because that's where a large number are coming from. A lot of their work is looking at current resources, disseminating those current resources to our buildings, making sure that teacher leaders have the knowledge on how to use those resources so that then those can be shared at the building level and then implemented in the classroom. They will plan events, they will plan professional development, both at the district level. If a building needs a very specific training on a specific topic, they'll call the curriculum office and someone will be deployed to a staff meeting or a couple staff meetings in order to deliver that information. They will stay current on research and the content around what we deliver, knowing what current practices are, any changes that are coming from the Ohio Department of Education in all the various content areas. They would keep abreast of that. This elimination hurts a lot. It's significant. We did look at keeping enough of the TOSAs there to support literacy, numeracy, and then also looking at a strong focus on just what are good instructional practices that would go across all content areas. Taking this much of a reduction will greatly limit the impact on being able to provide that individualized professional development to buildings. So we'd rely on more of a systemic a way of identifying a smaller set of practices that then we would specialize in and be able to deploy. Looking at building data would then help us determine which buildings would be able to support first, and we'd have to put those buildings in a tier and support the ones that are in greatest need first, and the others would be exploring that professional development on their own.
Okay. How does this impact what has been under development in terms of a strategic plan? I know that we've had extended discussion around a strategic plan for the district. How does this impact the district's strategic plan and, for all intents and purposes, our transition, what is our expected transition from F&Ds to higher?
I don't know if I could look into the crystal ball and predict the future on what that impact will be, but I know that it will greatly limit our capacity to deliver all professional development to all the buildings in the manner that we currently do it. We're going to have to look at how we use time differently. With the building calendar that we've just adopted, knowing that we have those early release days, that is time that we can deploy some of those folks to those buildings. We could look at time differently in terms of how can we preload, pre-train some teacher leaders to be able to then use those staff meeting times and that early release time to deliver that information at their own buildings. I think that, I don't know if we have all the answers right now because it's still early, but that's what we would have to do is look at what capacity do we have and how would we deliver that.
Is there a way to look at these reductions from the standpoint of what are our core areas of impact that we're trying to either make or continue to make, i.e. Reading, i.e. math, all of these things that on a state level we are constantly graded on? Is there a way to, again, try to align this most effectively to impact those areas where we are having either continued success or where we certainly have area and realm for growth and development?
Thank you for that, Board Vice President Cole. Yes and yes, but I have to go back and say it is going to impact the classroom. I can't sit here and say that it's not. There will be an impact, but this is a reduction and not an elimination in our teachers on special assignment. So then that means we gather our teachers on special assignment and we look at the job descriptions and look how we can deliver the quality instruction, also look at our priorities. That's K-3 literacy, look at the redesign of middle school, and look at our graduation priorities. So we're in the beginning of that phase, but to sit here and say that it won't impact, it will. Everything on here is going to impact. But please keep in mind that we will go back and we will meet with our executive director of teaching and learning and our directors of school improvement, and we will come together collectively to see how we can service our young people and make sure it is the least amount of impact. But I can't sit here and say that it won't impact our schools at all. I can't say that.
And if I may, when you look at that list of TOSA that are on page 7, you'll see that there are some that were considered that we are not recommending, and it goes back to your question about our strategic plan, our draft strategic plan, and those items that are critical to us being able to move forward even with these tough budget challenges. And so, English language arts is one of those that is not on the recommended list, but has been considered. School improvement TOSAs, again, these are the buildings in our district that need the additional support in order to, move out of those priority status into a higher level of performance. And so, again, these are the areas that we feel need our support the most as we go through these budget challenges. But as both Director Baker and also Chief Academic Officer Gillison have stated, when we've got to make hard choices, there are some hard choices that we have to make, and then there's some and then there are other decisions that we don't make because it's the best we can do to make sure we're able to move forward in these tough budget challenges.
And I want to thank the Vice President for bringing up the draft strategic plan, and I know that senior staff have worked a lot making sure that these recommendations align to that draft strategic plan, and we appreciate that. When we talk about values-based budgeting, that's what it's all about. Any other questions on page 7 or 8? Ms. Gibbs.
To his point, but maybe more specifically around reading recovery, we are investing in Achieve 3000, but we're cutting in reading recovery. How would those two balance out? And then what is our plan to meet our third grade reading guarantee targets with the reduction in reading recovery? And where will those reading recovery TOSAs go?
Sure. I want to also remind you that I forget which board meeting it was, but one of the last few, we also made a rather large purchase in a program called iReady, which is a reading progress monitoring tool, and as well, it has what's called the teacher toolbox with it, which is a significant amount of interventions that align specifically to deficiencies that an individual child would have. So as they go through the iReady assessment process, it'll identify those deficiencies and provide very specific interventions for them. So it's not like we haven't also brought in some other things for K-3. I just wanted to make sure that you were reminded of that. Reading recovery is a very specific reading intervention tool. It's a rather expensive one in that the reading recovery tutors can only serve a very small, limited number of students at any one given time. And so our feeling was, could we reallocate those resources in potentially a different way in order to make a larger impact with a larger group of students?
I want to make sure I didn't hear you say we're replacing reading recovery people with like computers. So we're replacing that with software.
No.
Okay.
No, iReady doesn't work like that. It identifies the interventions, but the interventions aren't all software-based. There is that interaction with an adult that comes along with it.
And so with that iReady, did it come with PD or technical assistance since we're cutting PD in every other area?
Yeah, that will come with the purchase of iReady, and with the contract comes with a significant amount of professional development for each building.
Okay, thank you.
Publisher provides.
They provide it so it's rolled into the cost of the new software, and we still have Achieve 3000. And do we still have the technical assistance with that software program?
Yes, because it's so new. We're still rolling that out.
Yeah.
We're in the first program.
We're in the first year of a 2-year contract with Achieve 3000, and understand that Achieve 3000 is secondary.
Okay. So as we're trying to steady the ship, but we keep adding new programs, how do we know which ones then will be working if we keep adding all of these layers? And when we are trying to decide where to cut, how do we know which ones are really working and which ones people are using and not using?
Sure, and that's a great question. Part of the reason with going with Achieve 3000 and iReady were that they would be district-wide, something that over time all of our buildings would be using, so that it can be monitored at a district level. When we have so many different intervention tools out there that are being used that aren't consistent, it is very difficult for us to monitor the usage, monitor the success at the district level to make those decisions, where when we have a smaller set of tools that are district-wide, we can monitor both usage and success.
And if I may, remember that we have short cycle assessments, BOE, MOE, and OI, that we're able to look at, how our students are performing, and then be able to hopefully be able to tie back whether or not that intervention has had an impact, along with, teacher evaluations and assessments in the classroom of those students and the progress that they're making, from day to day.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, colleagues, when we were planning for this meeting, we planned to conclude this discussion part at approximately 8 o'clock and move on to agenda item 5. It doesn't appear as though we are going to complete this part prior to 8 o'clock. And is it all right? Is everyone okay with continuing? All right, anyone want to take a break? Colleagues?
Take a 5-minute stretch break. Or we can keep moving, I don't know.
We may want to continue,
Yeah, we
I
might.
agree, but it may also make sense to schedule another time to finish this as well. Because even if we extend tonight, we won't get through all of it and have the discussion. Yeah,
Mr. Superintendent, let me ask you this. Do you want to continue on, and we'll build consensus here among board members as to how late we want to go. Do you want to continue on with this for the rest of the evening, or do you want to get to item 5 and then come back to the discussion? What's your preference? And colleagues, what are your thoughts?
My recommendation would be that we continue to discuss the items that are, under consideration. And then maybe we can use the next board meeting on the 6th to talk about the next steps and processing after we've had some time to reflect on it.
Make sense, Ms. Gibbs?
Thank you. So are we going to establish a time stopping point or a department stopping point?
I don't have a preference.
And then stop, I think that's a cleaner cut to say we're going to go all the way through, I don't know, get to business ops and then stop. 'Cause
Is that your
there's-
recommendation?
How many departments are here? 9?
Yes.
Anybody else?
Most of these, Mr. President, most, as you move, as we move forward through most of these pages, it looks like we've discussed a great deal of what needs to be discussed. I think we can move through these pages fairly quickly.
Yeah, if I could say it real quick, I do think we should maybe continue through this. Maybe we should take a 5-minute, but we should try to get through this document. And I think the impression that we want to leave on next steps are we do need to get, feedback, questions answered. We got to think about next steps. I just want to press upon, the desire that I have as an individual, and I'm sure the rest of the board shares this, is to have some sort of way that the public can weigh in. We need to think about those. I want to make sure that people, can have their say, can come in, can ask us questions after we've done this, whatever step that's at in this process. I just want to make sure that we're going to make sure we add that component in there. And that'll also give them time, because this is taking longer than we suspect, and I kind of figured it would. But then that can give them time, if they're starting to, they're starting to see our desire, what we kind of expect, for them to start thinking about and ask questions and stuff. But I do want to impress upon that I want to make sure that there's a community engagement piece where our people in the community can come and express their,
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Freddy. So what I think I hear is we'll continue on, and a lot of the rest of these pages are very slim on content, so they should probably go fairly quickly. What I'd like to do now is just take a very brief recess and come back at 8 o'clock. That's 5 minutes. It's been suggested that we establish a hard stop around 9 o'clock. So, colleagues, any objection?
Any objections with a 9 o'clock?
All right.
9.
So had we finished up on pages 7 and 8? All right, let's move on to page 9. Mr. Superintendent, page 9.
Yes, on page 9, we have accountability operations, and the budget items that are in this group are the operational support items within the Office of Accountability. And as I mentioned before, Dr. Michelle Klein, our Chief Accountability Officer, is here to represent the Accountability Office.
Questions on page 9? Hearing none. Thank you, Dr. Klein. Oh, Mr. Peretti, welcome back.
Page 9.
Accountability, we had an item that said documents that were
Could be, yes.
Yeah, so professional technical services, Coleman storage has been eliminated. So where will the files be stored at?
The files are being stored right now at the Central Enrollment Center because we have a second floor that has been renovated. So they are all locked up in the records room and
And that's central enrollment?
accounted for.
And that's at Fort Hayes?
Yes, sir, on the second floor.
Okay.
Thank you.
See how good of use Fort Hayes is, folks?
If there are no other questions on page 9, we'll move on to page 10.
Page 10 are the accountability programs, and these are programs supporting, these are budget items supporting academic achievement that is within the accountability office.
10, colleagues? Ms. Gibbs?
Can you simply tell us what NWA and MAP licenses are?
West Education Association Measures of Academic Progress is our formative assessment that we do for BOE, MOI, and OI, which is beginning of year, middle of the year, and end of the year. And as far as the license go, we are not required in grades 10, 11, and 12 to do those, but we do have many schools that use them in grades 10, 11, 12. This would actually, it was only considered, it was not recommended. It would have eliminated those licenses for our sophomores, juniors, and seniors, but that was only considered and not recommended.
How is that data used, and who uses it?
So how that is used is when those students actually take those measures of academic progress, the academic content teachers use those as well as the guidance counselors. It's also an ACT measure as well as an SAT measure. So there is a strong correspondence between the two particular tests. So it is it is a test prep.
So it's a test prep for?
Getting ready for an ACT, an SAT, those types of tests for college-bound students.
Okay, so if we were to eliminate it, what would they have left to use? What other assessments are in place?
The only other assessments that are closely related are the end of course, but remember, most of them are done by their sophomore year, so the junior and senior year would be void.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
If there are no other questions on page 10, we will move on to page 11.
Page 11 has is the accountability personnel page, and these are budget items that are proposed FTE reductions in the accountability office.
Questions, colleagues? Yes, ma'am.
If we eliminate the ESL assessor, will we still have capacity to serve? Do we still have someone in ESL to serve this role?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. Board Member Gibbs, what we currently have at the Central Enrollment Center is 3 full-time ESL assessors, and that would be reduced with this recommendation to 2 plus a part-time hourly that would come on during the months of August, September for our rush peak season. So we would be re-looking at how we do our assessments a little more creatively.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Page 12.
The third office to review is board services, represented by Dr. Roush, our government affairs and policy supervisor. And so on page 12 is the board services operations, and these budget items are the operation items for the board services office.
Questions on page 12, colleagues? Mr. Brown, what a surprise.
Just need to raise the question one more time in the context of this work that we are doing as we speak, and for the last couple of hours, and looking very hard at every person, every operation throughout the district. I think it's important for us to look at ourselves and look at our own expenses and where we can save. And I think that we need to revisit this over and over until we get it right. There are areas here where we can and should save and set a good example for everybody else that we're asking to do these very challenging and hard things.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Any other comments on page 12, colleagues? I thank you. Let's move on then to page 13. Questions?
Page 13 is the beginning of the fourth office that we are reviewing this evening, and that's the budget office, represented by Mr. Scott Gooding, our Executive Director of Budgeting. The first group on page 12 is budget operations. These are the operation budget items for the budget office.
Questions? Yes, Mr. Peretti.
So on page, is that page 14 as well? Well, that's programs, I'm sorry, never mind. I'll wait.
Any questions on page 13? Page 14?
Page 14 is the budget program group, and these are line items supporting academic achievement through the generation of new revenue for programs across the district.
Is this a position or is this a service?
This is a third-party contract that we have.
Will we be absorbing that internally then?
On this one, for the grant writer, it's on the list for considered, because what we didn't want to do is reduce this contract and sacrifice all the additional grant money that we've had. So if we eliminate the 80,000, we're eliminating millions of dollars that we've received in additional grants. So the return on investment doesn't make sense.
And considering that we are making reductions or program elimination in different areas, this particular service could be of greater value as a result of having to go out and identify new revenue sources in the form of grants.
Page 15?
Page 15 begins the business and operations section of the document, and this is the fifth office that we are reviewing, represented by our Chief Operations Officer, Maurice Oldham, our Senior Executive Director, Annette Marood, and our Senior Executive Director, Barbara McGrath, and last but not least, our Executive Director, Steve McElroy.
Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. My question is regarding the Safety and Security SRO program. I'd like to get an idea as to, again, what anticipated effects are we looking at seeing? I do know that there's been some quite a positive effect throughout the district. I'll use Independence High School, my experience there, and talking with even the police personnel that we had in that building, that they had a wonderful relationship, not only with the administration, but with the students as well. Are there ways that we look at this more effectively? How do we see food differently with this budget? But more importantly, what are going to be the effects with the reduction in staff?
Boardman McCall, looking at that particular line item, what you notice there shows 1 police sergeant, 2 relief officers, and 3 SROs. And so looking at our data from Safety and Security, this past year we added additional police sergeant. And the reason why that police sergeant was added because we added the 2 relief officers. Looking at the data, those 2 relief officers weren't really readily available this year because of different reasons, one on leave. And so looking at our data, we realized that we can do some things creatively. Looking at 3 other different schools, with the levy positions that we were giving through the levy, we were able to, in the schools that we reduce the 3 SROs, we can actually increase our safety student resource officers. So we have support in the school, and also have direct contact with our Director of Safety and Security to be more flexible. So again, what it's doing is, again, as I recall, we increased 2 relief officers. We were eliminating relief officers with the sergeant that came along with that. And then we reduced 3 SROs. But in those schools, the data shows that in those schools, we can do the same or provide safety with the increased level of SSRCs that we've been given.
Let's look at one of our schools, Lyndon McKinley. What does this cut mean, or this reduction mean for particularly a school like Lyndon McKinley that may have quite a degree of safety within our 4 walls, but without our 4 walls in the community, we've seen quite a number of issues that impact our students and our staff. What are we doing with that?
This particular recommendation is not stating to impact those schools. Again, we looked at this holistically and looked at the entire safety and security operation as well as the district. And again, we have staff assigned to schools, as you know, when need arises. We also are able to reposition staff to different schools. The flexibility that it gives us utilizing those levy positions, it allows us also, if we have a need, if we have to go in and for a week, send additional staff, we're able to utilize some of those positions. In this case, we're looking at schools based on the data that has not had an influx, and we're able to supplement the SRO with an additional SSRC officer.
Other questions, Mr. Peretti? Please.
Question, and I'm sorry, I wasn't paying attention. I apologize. So I just want to double check on the SRO. Was that included in our levy request? Just okay.
So let me just clarify this so the SRO are the police officers. The SSRC are the student safety resource officers. We have positions that was part of the levy request, and so those positions come on board, gives it the opportunity to reduce our SRO officers.
Okay. Don't let other people ask questions, but I have some more.
Okay, we'll come back to you. Board Member Reyes?
So on here, we have the recommendation of elimination of quota passes for internships. So we're back at the 120-hour requirement. So if we're not going to help and get transported, are we thinking about getting rid of the 120, reducing it, or is this a reduction? And have we done a study on the benefits of, and trust me, as a person who benefits from a community center perspective, the assistance of students actually internship in our community centers, I don't want to see it reduced, but are we looking at that possibility as we are trying to eliminate passes?
So what you see before you in the recommendation is eliminating the 11th, 12th grade quota passes, and have to get creative ways of getting students to internships. What happened is previously, every student was given, 11th, 12th grade was given a quota pass, whether they had an internship or not, and the number really didn't present itself. So again, because of the budget cuts, this is a recommendation that's has been put on to recommend reduction. Yes, in creative ways, it'll have to be look at other creative ways with our partners in trying to get students to those internships.
So every student was given a bus pass? Because I thought
Let me say it
we had
differently. Let me say it down, I apologize. Every student had the ability to receive one, or in our budget count, we accounted for every student with the possibility of having the authorization to get one, if you were 11th and 12th grade.
Because I thought we had eliminated that with the last $50 million cut that we did.
9th and 10th grades.
That was 9th and 10th graders.
Okay. Let's see, then now we also have, back to the Chromebooks and laptops here. We're recommending the elimination of purchase of new Chromebooks. Is that, we're hoping Title I funds will do that. And then it also talks here about laptops for students that need a laptop to attend college classes. How many students is that, and are we looking for an alternative within the college or some of our community partners to replace those? Because I know that there's a couple community partners that offer free laptops if you go through their program.
Board Member Reyes, thanks for that question. We actually had $50,000 in the budget this year to provide laptops for college classes and have not used that money. So that's why it's been eliminated. Nobody has requested one this year. The Chromebooks that you see are one of the things that could be covered by capital expenses, and that's why that's taken out of the general fund expenses.
Okay. And then lastly, we have field trips again here. Are we eliminating them? What are we doing? That's almost $1 million.
So, Board Member Reyes, thank you for that question. Just for clarification purposes, we work collaboratively with the academic side to make sure that we provide the services to balance the need for our children. But at the same time, we've been asked to look at recommendations of reductions for services that are not required by law. So field trips obviously are not required by law. That's why this is a recommendation, but it is a recommendation of eliminating field trips.
Any kind of field trips, co-side field trips? I mean, I'm assuming these are specific field trips that we're eliminating, or you're eliminating all field trips?
So we're not eliminating the field trips. This conversation is eliminating transportation to the field trips via our transportation department. My understanding is, from a general fund perspective, the school, from a building-based approach, the school still could fund a field trip, but transportation department would not pay for those services.
So it'll come out of a different budget, is what you're saying? So not necessarily that a teacher or a school building no longer can transport students for field trip purposes. It would be just at a different line item.
That's correct.
Okay.
Board Member Brown?
Thank you. Got several questions on this page, and they're really all focused on transportation. And there are at least 5 different scenarios on here, or options, that deal with very significant amounts of savings if we were to look at decreasing the amount of transportation we provide, and some of that depends on how we look at school choice. Obviously, this is one of the big topics, and in a previous memo from Dr. Sanford, it was in a section called Re-envision. And given the fact that this could save anywhere from $5.5 million to $14.8 million in these various options, and that's year after year, so potentially up to $60 million over the time frame that we're talking about here. I think that we really do need to take a hard look at this. Yes, I love the idea of what we do and providing school choice and providing transportation for everybody, but I think given our circumstances, that we just need to really take a harder look and see if this is important enough that we can say to the community, we need you, community, to fund this to the extent of, this many dollars. Will you support us doing this? We want to do it, but will the community support it is really the question. If the community gave us the support, we'd do all this and more. But given where we are, and I think we, and I don't know who wants to address it, but
Thank you for raising this question and highlighting those 5 items. So there were 2 items that the senior leadership team is recommending that we take the next several months in 2018 to really dig deep into those 2 issues, come up with recommendations through that process and through that investigation, to come up with recommendations by the end of August, beginning of September, so the board would then have the next couple of months in the fall to review those recommendations and then hopefully, make a decision on those items, prior to the lottery system being put in place and also prior to the next budget conversation. Those 2 items are facilities and transportation. And these 5 options are the things that we have considered as a part of this reduction process and this budget challenge that we have, that we think could be the start of that conversation. It is our recommendation that we begin those conversations in that process as soon as possible so that we give ourselves enough time to really explore all the issues that are impactful in both of those areas. So for instance, with transportation, it's the issues of access and accessibility as a district of choice, making sure that every student in the district that participates in the choice program has the ability to have access to those opportunities. But again, weighing the cost associated with that, being able to engage the public and the community to get a better understanding of how valuable those this program of transportation tied to our choice program is to the community. And again, as you say, are we willing to make the investment in order to keep going down the road we are going, or do we look at another way and re-envision how we are providing those type of services and opportunities for our students and their families? But because all of those issues are so big, we don't think it's fair to try and get the board to make a decision on that right now. And that's why we're strongly recommending as a senior leadership team that we take the good part of 2018 to really dig deeper into those issues.
I agree, and I thank you for that response. Yeah, we do need to take a hard look, and I didn't expect that we can make a decision on that tonight or next month, but we do have to start that study process and discussion process, and it's going to take some time, but there aren't any areas that we can avoid scrutinizing. Everything has to be on the table and subject to scrutiny, and if we can't justify it, then we have to act on it.
Thank you. And Board Member Gibbs is next, then Mr. Peretti.
Thank you. So I have a couple of questions, but just to speak to Board Member Brown's point and to offer the perspective of I don't need much time at all to say we absolutely need high school transportation. And until our public transit system, until we get sidewalks for our kids to walk on, let alone a public transportation system that's accessible to students, we don't have ways for our kids to get to school, let alone to a bus, because now they won't have bus passes, to pay for those, then to get on the bus, to get to high school, and to get to the schools where they need to go. So I know it's a big stone to be unturned, but you can ask me now, you can ask me 6 months from now, my answer is still going to be no, because what comes with the high poverty district are all of the challenges of high poverty families, most of them being in transportation, in safe housing, in accessible areas where they're able to get to a form of transportation to get to our school buildings. And so it's one of the necessary supports that we need to move forward. So that's my point on that. But my question then, to that point, for what we have now and for such a critical decision, and I'm not advocating for taking too much stuff off the board, but we need a transportation director. We need leadership and expertise in this area. So as we're considering, and if we were to look at what you want, the deep dive into transportation is whether or not we can make impossible possible. And I know we have experience, because I know our COO has it, and I know our interim director has it, but we are lacking leadership, and transportation is one of the number one drivers to our customer relations office. It is our number one complaint. It is what drives people's blood pressures through the roof when my kindergartner is not home until 5 and 6 o'clock, and school is out at 3. And sometimes 2:30, and especially our parents with special needs students. I'm talking about as a mom who's had to sit at the bus stop and not make it to the school board meeting because I'm waiting for the bus to show up. So I wouldn't advocate for taking too much off of the table, and I know it's a cost savings, but it is coming at a cost of leadership and efficiency that's specifically focused on transportation. And I know we have the expertise at the table, but if we are going to run on bare bones, then we need the best bones we got. And everybody needs to be laser focused, and someone needs to be specifically 100% dedicated to making sure those thousands of students are getting home in a timely manner, safely, and can help advocate in that area. That is a statement. That's my point on that.
Would like to respond briefly.
Just real quickly, and I know you didn't mean to say it the way you said it, but I just want to say that Mr. Oldham, and especially Steve McElroy, has provided tremendous leadership during this period. He has re-envisioned the way that our transportation office is working and the way that the culture and climate of our transportation department is night and day to what it used to be. And so I know you didn't mean that.
What I meant
but I
to
just
say
want to
is-
I just want to make that public statement of the type of leadership we're getting.
My initial statement was we have tremendous expertise already. Mr. Odom, you. I've seen all of you in all of these areas.
But Mr. McElroy as well.
And Mr. McElroy as
Yes.
well. However, we're missing a director of transportation. And
But we're not missing leadership, though.
We're not missing leadership,
Okay.
but we are missing specific expertise in this position
Okay.
that is solely dedicated to transporting our students safely to and from the thousands of buildings and routes that they run twice a day. We have a significant bus fleet. We have a brand-new bus fleet. Our students are in some tremendous buildings. I would offer that would be the one position that needs to come off the table for the reasons of wanting to look at it, having to come up with new routes, and doing some other things, because everyone else has millions of things on their plate. I want one person that's solely dedicated to making sure my kids get home safe, and they get picked up and dropped off on time, and so are the thousands of other parents who have to depend on our buses to get their brother and sister off the bus so that they can walk safely on a street with no sidewalks, with no street lights to get home. I'm just going to say that. And that's to all the partners and the city. We're going to need everyone to do that. Around the elimination of the bus passes, I will also say that it will be a tremendous blow to the internship program at our schools that are significantly designed around that. So I hope that reduction still allows for that program to operate. That school, COS, does not have athletics, so they don't benefit from keeping coaches and some of that, maybe dance instructors, but that is a critical part of that program, and altering that will change it. My question is this: if we're getting rid of the internship coordinators, we're getting rid of the bus passes to get to internship, I don't see where we're really saying we value and we believe we can make internships happen for our kids. We're removing every single support for it. So what is the realistic strategy to help our students reach that 120 in a meaningful way? I'm not talking about come to school and you can stay and clean up for 8 hours and then we're going to count that towards internship. I'm talking about program fidelity to working in the community with our business partners to gain internship experience that they can use. How are we doing that, removing all of the supports? That's a question for the team.
I can speak to the reduction in our CCRCs, and with the help of Pegeen Cleary and her Career Tech Department, before we made the recommendation for the reduction in the number of CCRCs, we met, we talked about it, and we feel like that we can still provide those supports.
Okay. From a budget standpoint, I don't see where we have that in place, but we'll look forward to that strategy.
All right.
My last question, though, around on this page, is around the LEDE tracking software. Is that a reduction or elimination? And if we do eliminate it, how do we propose to then track our community partnership and our role in community support and supporting LEDEs?
This is really neither a reduction or elimination of the software. It's just that the budget was prepared and projected before we put that out for a request for proposal. And the software that we purchased is less than what was budgeted for it, so that money is available to go back into the budget.
So what I hear you saying is that we do have, in fact, software that will track our LEDE monitoring. And these are cost savings you were able to identify.
That's correct. We're in the implementation process now. We have training scheduled in February, and we'll be going live within the next month.
Thank you so much. Thank you, President Baker.
Thank you. And Mr. Preddy, if you don't mind yielding to Mr. Brown.
Thank you. Ms. Gibbs, I just wanted to go back to one item, and that is the transportation and the choice area. It's an area, especially with its size, that I think is worthy of scrutiny. The things that you mentioned absolutely should be, will be factored into that scrutiny, and they may prevail. But I don't think that we can take anything off the table. Those things that are mandatory, we don't have a choice there. but I think that this is an area that is worthy of scrutiny. If it turns out as a result of that, that those factors outweigh the costs, then, then we as a board decide to continue it and figure out how we fund that and everything else. But I just don't agree that we don't apply the same scrutiny to these questions as we do to lots of others.
Oh, sure. I agree with you. I agree that you could apply the scrutiny, and I also think when we take this to our community will then weigh in. As another part to Dr. Stanford's point, when we talk about honoring levy promises, our school choice was a part of Steps of Change under Dr. Larry Mixon, under like the 2000 levy, and the Steps of Change provided choice as a part of that levy promise, and it provided a way for students to then be able to access, to your point, all of the different programs that I see so beautifully put on the wall. But just because it's not the current levy promise doesn't weaken the promise. It was still a promise made, promise kept. And so if we're talking about altering promises, I believe it can all be scrutiny. I'm just saying miss me on the conversation, so my answer is going to be the same as then as it is now, which is going to be no.
I almost forgot my questions, but they came back to me.
Imagine.
So I just need just a quick, so when it comes to Dakota passes, I really hope we put the screws Dakota for the $160,000. That's one point. They should be helping us out. I really want to see that, if that's a possibility. My second thing is when we talk about operations, what is, and I just don't know what it is, operating budget for capital improvement department funded from capital funds? What is that 311,000? Is that just sort of shifting us some funds and that? The second line item on page 15.
Board Member Peretti, what that is currently in the capital improvements budget. The 300,000 comes out of general fund. Previously, years past, that's come out of capital funds. And what we're suggesting is to, of those other capital fund options that we have, just consider, recommend moving it over to the capital fund side and put money back to general fund.
Okay, so that's moving it to a different stream. Okay. And what is CBTS Managed Services server team? What is that?
So we had a server team from CBTS that we paid a contract for, and they managed our server. With the levy positions, we were able to bring those positions in-house, so we've hired people now that are CCS employees who will fill those positions. We no longer need that contract.
And so that wasn't built into our earlier forecasts and budgets from last year, or just kind of curious why we're just now doing that? Haven't gotten into the 18-19 budget yet, and it wasn't, and we couldn't assume it from 17-18 budget?
That amount of money was built into the forecast because at the time that budget was done was prior to the passage of the levy.
Very good. And, food service fund, pay for utility costs. That's quite an amount of money. What's the alternative? What does that even mean?
Many districts charge food service a cost for utilities or some operating expenses. In some districts, it's utilities. In some districts, it's rent for their building. Our food service department is in the black and is doing very well. Mr. Brown has looked at that really carefully, and he has determined that he could afford to pay for utilities or a portion of utilities out of the food service funds, so he would take over roughly $200,000 out of food service funds to pay for utilities. They are already currently paying for utilities in the food production center, so this is just the kitchens in the buildings.
But these aren't Rotary funds, so isn't our bottom line aren't we already seeing the benefit from that? So like, it's not like food services, do they have an encumbrance in the next year that just stays with their budget? And that's why, I get that I'm kind of confused on how it's a savings.
Food service is a self-supporting fund. So the funds that food service actually makes go back into the fund to pay for their expenses. They're currently running a few $1 million in the black. That money stays with the fund to provide future expenses, and some of it is used for replacement of equipment, just expenses for food service.
So they're unique then,
Right.
new to me,
Right, food service gets no money from the general fund.
but they did at one point,
They did at one point several years ago when they were
before
running in
the
the red.
federal grant.
Right.
So every year that they're in the black, that money, does that money stay with them, and then we reappropriate an amount of money?
Yep.
Like not zero-based, is kind of what I'm getting at? So when they have a balance that's in the black, and this is just a process question, because I just don't know, why doesn't that just go back in the general revenue fund dollars?
Food service funds
It
need.
could be law, I don't know.
By law, food service funds need to stay with the food service. It can't be used to supplement the general fund. But those funds can be used to pay for their expenses. Such as utilities. It's already pays for all their food, all their supplies, all their personnel, all of those expenses already.
I just learned something. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Thank you. I think that wraps up my questions for this section.
Vice President?
I understand we were talking about, having, that we're not filling positions. I respect that. I really do. And I respect the work that our folks that have stepped up to do those jobs. Thank you very much. It's tough. Everyone can always use the help, but I do appreciate these two areas right here, purchasing and transportation. I know we are, trying to reimagine some of these looking in the future, but I just want to let you know that I do appreciate the way that the team has been able to come together and work without these unfilled positions. Thank you.
Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. Dr. Stanford, you mentioned the leadership, particularly of transportation. I'm well aware of the culture internally that has changed, and thankful for that leadership. I'm not necessarily supportive of hiring another administrator. I think that we're doing a good enough job, but as we continue this conversation around cuts in transportation, what I'm interested in knowing is the quality versus the quantity and how we make that kind of decision. And what I mean is this, is there are several key indicators that we as educators look at for student success. One of those key indicators is attendance, And my sister colleague alluded to that and actually hit it right on the head. So from the qualitative and quantitative standpoint, is there a way for us to look at data, to mine data, to get some sort of projection or idea as to what the impact on a student attendance will be with these types of cuts made to our transportation? So I'd like to really use a real key indicator that we look at, right, that we use to evaluate our student success as one of those things that helps me make a really informed decision about a cut. Because on face value, I'm right there with W. Shauna Gibbs. I cannot support this as I see it. But if we're able to figure out some way here to align this to our strategic plan, to our key indicator around attendance, how do we then make something like this work? How do we tease this in a way that becomes a win-win situation where in my mind, students are not hurt and communities are not hurt. I live in a neighborhood with no sidewalks, and I absolutely, in this time of year, abhor the idea of having to drive up and down streets and see our children standing on the corner. By the way, and I'm not being biased here, but by the way, my two children are two of those students, my two babies. And I take their friends and their student colleagues, I treat them the same way. So how do we look at this from a key indicator point of attendance? How do we tease this out as the conversation ensues? I'd like that to be one of those assumptions if we could.
So to answer your question, the way that we can monitor and assess the connection that you're making right now between transportation and attendance. At least as I think about it, there are two key performance indicators that we could monitor that are part of the draft strategic plan. One would be on-time arrival of students through the transportation system. That's a key performance indicator that we have. I know Mr. Oldham and Mr. McElroy have been working on making sure that the data that comes out of that key indicator is good, reliable data as a part of our planning going forward. And then on the academic side, as a part of the draft strategic plan, there is an objective around attendance. And so if these changes were to be made, we would definitely be able to monitor the on-time arrival of our buses and monitor that as a key performance indicator, but also monitor attendance and see whether there's been a drop in attendance with changes that have been made. And so you would have to put both of those indicators together as a part of our ongoing monitoring of the entire strategic plan. Because the point of having a strategic plan and having those key performance objectives and having key performance indicators is that we're monitoring that data on a regular basis. So whether it's quarterly or monthly, we're monitoring that data on a daily basis to see if there are any major changes, and if there are major changes in performance, we then begin to analyze why that change has occurred. And if needed be, what interventions or what additional strategies should be developed to, counteract the negative results that we're seeing.
Thank you. Board Member Reyes?
So Dr. Stanford, just going kind of back on, so I believe when I first started on the board, we had the whole conversation about school choice, neighborhood schools, busing. I don't know if the data is going to be too old, but I recall at that time we had significantly reduced or low attendance rates because we did not provide adequate busing. And when we began to provide the appropriate busing, then we started seeing academic changes. We started seeing attendance rates. I mean, I think we were down to even in some schools 70%. So adding the buses and having that whole conversation over these several years, there has to be some data mining that we can do on that is specific to this district. Even though those kids have already matriculated, when we were able to make decisions about bringing busing into the district versus having it outside and hiring bus drivers here, we were able to see, the difference between having control over those parameters or whether our kids got to school and to home safe because we were able to bring that in-house and how our attendance numbers actually rose. So I think there's data within our district already that we can utilize to make the case. But I think, and I know Mr. Baker talked about that early on in his career on the board about the difference between, I think what sometimes increases our cost is the difference between school choice and neighborhood schools. And there's a rebuttal to that as far as what are the advantages of having school choice when you're in an environment of competition of charter schools and private schools and religious schools and all those other schools being offered and taking students away from the district. The strategy at that time was bringing students back into the district so that they knew that they could be in this district and get the same things and get the same education and the same advantages that they would if they went somewhere else. So that's my 2 cents.
Roy, do you have something to add to that?
Thank you, President Baker. And to Vice President Cole's point, and to dovetail on what Dr. Stanford was stating, I do want to mention also that in the Transportation Department, we're working directly with the Ohio State University College of Engineering, who is working with us to identify inefficiencies and routing procedures and to focus on those KPIs that we just discussed. Ohio State University has 2 students that work with us at least 4 days a week to map out those processes so we can look at those inefficiencies, if you will, and also to focus on on-time performance. I state that because we are definitely looking internally at all that data to make sure that whatever decisions we make are comprehensive decisions that do affect our students, not only at the school delivery, but at each and every bus stop. So I want to ensure you that we are definitely looking at that data and making the best decisions possible with the resources that we have.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments on page 15? 15. All right, let's move on to page 16.
Page 16 is the sixth office in our review, and that office is communications, represented by our executive director, Scott Varner. The first budget item is the communication operations, and it's related to our radio station.
I just want to hear the recommendation.
So as this board knows, since 1956, the district has had a very valuable asset in WCBE. It was the first to carry national public radio. It's now a recognized contributor both locally to news, programming, local music. But as part of our commitment to identify any potential opportunities to reduce costs while still maintaining the highest level of service as possible, we've envisioned a proposal that actually may do a little bit of both. Many public stations, radio stations across the country, enter into management agreements with outside nonprofit organizations, enter into agreements that ask those nonprofit organizations to manage the radio station. We have such a nonprofit here in Columbus that has set up a proposal to do just that. It's WCBE Ohio, and this is the 501c3 that currently supports the operations of WCBE. So under this proposal, it would be that the district enter into this management agreement with WCBE Ohio and allow the nonprofit to run the station. In exchange, the organization would provide a return, a source of revenue back to the district. In the proposal that you see before you, we've just inserted a placeholder of $75,000 per year. That would be a revenue, not a savings. So these are new dollars that would come to the district. And again, that's just a placeholder as we continue to have conversations with that organization. But most importantly, it would allow the district to still maintain ownership of this valuable asset. So that's the proposal before you.
Ms. Gibbs?
So could we not make $75,000 on our own?
So that $75,000 represents the payment by that outside organization, that 501c3, to the district.
So my question is, do we have the ability, creativity, or vision to get $75,000 without partnering with the outside organization?
So perhaps I'm not understanding the question, because that would be asking a district entity that currently operates on its own. So WCB, as you know, is an enterprise fund. It raises 100% of its own funding. A majority of that comes from listeners, from corporate supporters, underwriters, as well as dollars that come from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in Washington. Those dollars currently cover the operation of that station. I don't know if there would be a potential to say to the station, in addition to raising those dollars to cover your operations, to raising additional dollars to cover some sort of payment back to the district's general fund.
Yeah, my question was, are there any other creative ways where we could raise dollars from our side to raise $75,000? That's a question for another time. I would be interested in seeing that before I would move forward. But as I know how you only work 25/8 as opposed to 24/7, there's a reduction of a communication specialist. Can you speak to that and how we would still be able to get our message across a very, very crowded field of news? How would we still be able to tell our story if we reduce the specialists?
So the other proposal that's on the list for communications, as you know, our media technology team, which is represented here tonight, has always been responsible for for basically two major services. The first is serving the communication needs at the district level. To your point, Ms. Gibbs, those conversations and our ability to communicate our message out through video and communicate the board's message. It's our media technology team that takes care of helping broadcast the board's meetings. But there's a second service that the media technology team has often been asked to cover, and that's more of a legacy function of assisting the media and technology needs at our building levels, helping supply AV equipment, setting up screens and microphones, providing video cameras for teachers for certification, managing education on demand videos or distance learning opportunities. Our proposal would be by realigning those legacy services back to the building level, allowing the building levels to decide their AV needs, having that covered at the building level. It would allow us to reduce that full-time position, but more so allow that media technology team to focus on exactly what you've talked about, and that's being a core function of our communications efforts, not legacy AV support back to the buildings.
Is there additional training or professional development that accompanies that strategy for reduction?
I think what we've discovered is that on many of those technologies, that technology has advanced enough where many of our teachers already know how to use Skype. They know how to use the on-demand video channels, whether it be YouTube or Discovery Ed, those things that we have already. And so some of those services have just become a function as our teachers, our staffs become more understanding of how today's technology works and the opportunities that are available and much easier to access online.
I understand that as anecdotally, but do we have data that supports that each one of our buildings has at least one, if not a backup person that can do that AV? If you could, as we move forward through this process, share that information so we know that we're not leaving our buildings at a deficit around an assumption and that we don't know for a fact that we provided that professional development. Because as we are reducing so many things, field trips, PD, the building resources are going to have to become that much more proficient in everything. And I would hate to cut a support believing that people have that aptitude and capacity, because it's not easy, which is why we have specialists, and then that building is then without that type of expertise and support.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbs. Board Member Brown?
Thank you. Just very briefly with respect to WCBE, I'm pleased to see this recommendation here. I'm pleased to see the creative approach to addressing this. I think that we are not in the radio business. We're in the school business of educating our young people. And you mentioned how the asset has value, significant value. I don't know what that is, but the question that I think need to look at is, does it make sense for Columbus City Schools to continue to own that asset? What's the benefit of our doing that? Or are we better off, like with unused buildings or other valuable properties, something that we should consider not owning, selling, and putting those dollars into our core mission of educating our young people. Just something that, and we may go through the process of looking at it and decide it makes sense to keep, but I think we need to take a hard look at it. And, realizing some dollars back because of a management agreement is great, but there may be even more. So, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Brown. Mr. Vice President?
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you for this proposal that, just for, again, point of clarification, makes this $75,000 proposed revenue for the general fund, yes?
Correct. Again, that's been a placeholder, as we still have yet to have either very detailed conversations with that organization and what that management agreement would look like.
Thank you for that. As we continue this conversation about the value add proposition of our ownership of WCBE, I think it'd be very important, because I think some of what I'm hearing my colleagues say, and certainly where I am positioned, is where is this of academic advantage to our youngsters? This radio station is centered right in the heart of Fort Hays. We have communications programs. We currently have an active radio show with youngsters from this district utilizing that resource of the radio station every Saturday. Can we continue in our conversation of ownership to see how we leverage this resource to not only be of support to our students, but again, to be a tool of better telling our story, our district narrative, our successes, and not necessarily having that as something articulated from other media sources. So I see potential opportunities, to say it scientifically, I see potential energy here. But thank you for this so far.
If I can, just very quickly, you are correct, and is in part of our discussions with that nonprofit organization. They too see the educational value that can be provided through WCBE and its work with our career technical students who are looking to be a part of radio engineering or some of that work. But one thing to recognize is the equipment at WCBE, the infrastructure in that building is quite old. And one of the challenges that we face with that is that, as an example that I often use, we've had students that who have been asked to come there to work on the equipment, to be a part of a show, and it is equipment that is generations older than they are. That half of the staff at WCBE is younger than the equipment they are on. And while there is some educational benefit to working on older equipment, it is not providing the highest level of educational return. And so as we look to find those ways to increase the educational opportunities at WCBE, we know that some of it will require more investment. And whether that investment is through our dollars or through the investment made by this nonprofit organization who also has a vested interest in seeing academics be a part of it. That, I think, is kind of the cornerstone of your conversation, sir, and I agree with you.
Thank you very much for that. There's somebody who's on radio for 4 years in that same situation on WVKO AM 1580. Machines that was older than me, I get it. Thank you.
If there are no additional questions on 16, I see that it's gone 9 o'clock. So if there's anything else anybody wants to share this evening, any of my colleagues have any final remarks? Mr. Peretti?
We're doing final remarks right now, kind of, on the rest of the document? Okay, well, I mean, I just want to, on page 17, I think is something that we've been sort of talking about a lot. We've been looking at, different things that we could do district-wide. And, I know it's not a process that would happen right away, but when we talk about building consolidation, I think it's really important. We have a really good history here at CCS of doing that over the last 10 years when I first got on the board and prior to that. I think, yes, we do have a new FMP. And I do realize that facilities are an ongoing process. That's why I've always thought that we should have a permanent facilities committee to constantly be looking at this. But part of what we're going to have to do when we do go to the levy and do ask people for property tax dollars for capital or building again, is we're going to have to make some tough decisions, especially, at the high school level. And I do believe that there are some things that we can do without additional bond dollars. I know we have some underutilized schools. I do know that we're going to have a process that goes into next year. My whole question is, we're going to be able to settle this one way or another. The budget situation is going to be settled. We're going to settle it. But some of these other things that I know we have to do for the long-term stability of the district, I don't want to see them fall off. And, we get through this budget scenario and then we do not get back to the issue of the buildings. It's not okay that some of our buildings are inequitable when it comes to physical resources. It's not okay at all. And it's not okay that we're spending a lot of money for buildings that are less than half full. Now, capacity is one thing on a big list of things that we look at for buildings, but I would like us to we really need to take this serious. It's something that we're going to have to do to show, hey, we're serious about asking for property tax dollars. We're serious about, what we're using our buildings for. I would like to see us start that process, as well as I'd like to see the administration start the process of looking at, what does that mean? So how do we look at our boundaries? How do we look at our zones? Whatever that is, so that we can start getting to this point. Because there are savings here. There are savings in building consolidation, especially at the high school level. Eventually, I'd like to see the district fulfill what we wanted to do with the FMP and renovate and rebuild schools, so all of our kids have great schools. But there is some fat that needs to be cut. And to me, I just want to make sure that that's out there, that we're having that conversation, that we're doing all the things internally that we need to do to get to that point over this next year, and as a board, that we are having that conversation with you over this next year. We have to do this. We have to do it. We can't keep on growing as a school district with the current infrastructure that we have. So I just really want to stress that point, because I do not want to see continued cuts. I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can. And this is a positive thing. It hurts, yeah, I get it. People went, someone could have gone to school there, or, yes, it's not the greatest. But it's also not okay that all of our schools aren't the same. They're not fantastic. They're not anchors in their neighborhoods. They should all be doing more than just, especially in the high school level, 9-12. What else can they be doing? How else can the rec centers help us? What else can we do for these buildings? I just want us to take this serious, and I know we are, and we have been. But I am going to be hounding on it any chance that I get. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Peretti. Any other super brief closing remarks, Mr.
Just
Brown?
one very super brief.
Mr. Brown, and then Ms. Vice President.
Thank you. And again, I do want to keep it brief. The items on page 17 absolutely do need to be looked at, and looked at hard. I understand that they're all being, they're not being put forward for recommendation at this point. I'm a little bit surprised at the second item down, which shows not required, low ROI. But in terms of the rest of this, I think we need to look at it. I do want to thank all of you for the work that's gone into this. I know it's a lot of time and a lot of effort, and none of this is fun. This is all challenging, difficult work that, many of you are going to feel bad about having to do. I understand that. But we all have our job to do, and we have to work through this, support each other in it, but clearly we owe it to the community, the entire community, not just those students and parents that are engaged with us, but the entire community, to right-size the district and to right-size the program to the resources that we have and will be available to us.
Thank you. Mr. Vice President?
Thank you. Very briefly. Thank you so much for this presentation thus far. On page 21, I see where there have been some cuts to administration. I'd like us, as we move forward, because I know you can't necessarily answer that now, not looking for a response now, so to speak. But can we take a look, or are we taking a look at where we're making other cuts to administration on that level of things? I did not see that much throughout the document. I'd love to be able to see that. I know our community is concerned about that as well. Thank you.
Ms. Gibbs?
Yes. So to that point, I know that we only have a few pages left, but I do believe each one of them deserves for us to go through them. So my question is a part of the process. Is this something we can tackle in a work session at the beginning of our next board meeting? Or, just to answer these few pages, maybe if we add a quick session to go over them, because there may be something on these last pages that people in our community and that we as a board want to discuss as well. So I want to make sure we don't wave off the last few pages and that we either put it at, we're together again next week. So if we can add a work session at the beginning of the meeting and then move with our forward, or add it towards the end. But I do believe that we should give these last pages all due diligence so that we as a board can say, we have fully reviewed in an equitable manner all of the recommendations, and then move forward in hearing from the administration about the community engagement or how we'll take it to the community. But I don't want to lose these last few pages, and I don't think it'll take long, but I do want to go through them later.
Yes,
Do you think, I mean, we kind of have been discussing the district-wide page kind of here and there throughout the whole discussion. Do you think it would take long for us to get through page 18, 19, 20, and 21?
we already agreed on a 9 o'clock hard stop. Superintendent earlier said, we'll just finish this up at the next meeting. We'll talk about the community engagement. So every single one of these pages deserves full consideration. I want us to all have the time to discuss it. I want folks to be able to participate in that discussion. So we'll finish this up at the next meeting. We'll make time. The next meeting agenda is relatively brief, so we'll have time. All right, any other?
I just want to add see, that was a question, and now it's time for the remark. But my remark is simply, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. This represents thousands of hours of this entire team that did not introduce themselves and the roles that they play. But we know that every day you make this district work with or without all of the resources. We appreciate each and every one of you. We ask tough questions, but y'all got to live with the tough answers. And so we're still partners in this, and along with the parents and the staff that you don't see in the room, but we're all here for those 51,000 students, and we're just hoping to have the best outcome. But you are appreciated. We appreciate all of your work.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbs. And thank you all for being here tonight. We do want to hear from you. Oh, Board Member Reyes.
I just want to say thank you. Like everybody else. Same thing. I just want to say thank you for all the work that you've done. Thank you for tolerating our questions. I know we'll have more questions. And I know we mentioned that we wanted to hear from the community, but I think most importantly, I think our community, our teachers, our bus drivers, our custodians, those folks, if you have any questions, you have any concerns, you want to talk, I would suggest that you see our team here in front of you and on the TV. You know who they are. Please do create a dialogue, concerns, alternatives. The hardest thing for every cut that we've been involved in for some of the senior members is that nobody wants their program to be cut. No one wants their line item to be cut. And obviously, we don't want to do that either. But we are in a time where we need to be creative, we need to be innovative, we need to understand what our limitations are, and if we need to move within, which I like the creativity of the staff to look at where we can move money so it can be paid from other resources, grants, things like that. I think we need to really hear those comments also. In addition to, we know that you're concerned about the loss of jobs and loss of resources, but we want to make sure that some of those creative ideas, those conversations are going as we continue to go through these processes. And to reiterate, nothing has been cut from the board. These are conversations that we're currently having. We are receiving a lot of questions from the community about programs and cuts and changes within the district or within a school building. We'd ask you to please contact your administrator if you have any questions, or somebody in the superintendent's office if you have any questions. But from our perspective, from this process, this is still a conversation.
So thank you all for being here. Thank you for staying so late. We do want to hear from you. Talk to us. You received this document when you came in. There are many ways for you to interact with the district. Please do share any thoughts that you have, and you will also have opportunities at subsequent meetings to sign up to speak at a meeting as well. So if there's nothing else, for the good of the order, the chair will entertain a motion that we adjourn the meeting.
We adjourn.
Moved and seconded. Mr. Treasurer?
President Baker?
Yes.
Vice President Cole?
Yes.
Ms. Reyes? Ms. Gibbs? Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Peretti?
Yes.
Motion carried.
Thank you. We stand adjourned. Thank you and good evening.